Chapter 1. A knock beneath the floorboards. The rain had not stopped for 7 days, and by the 7th it felt less like weather and more like a decision the sky had made. It came as sheets and streamers, drifting across the meadows with a low hiss, pooling in the ruts of the farm road until the truck tires wore shiny gullies into the clay. It softened the orchard ground so that every step sank and released with a sucking sound. In the night, the water thudded on the roof with the patient insistence of a hand that never tired. Isabel Crowe stood at the kitchen sink listening to it, the wet cadence of a town held under a pail. The old farmhouse smelled of murky apples and damp wood. The Crowes had lived in it since it was a simple rectangle of rough-cut pine. The additions, rooms tacked on as needs changed, porches enclosed in winter, and kept that way, made the house feel like a creature grown lopsidedly around a wound. The window over the sink gave a view of the orchard. Even in the dark, even with the bulbs over the back steps throwing a tired cone onto the slick boards, she could see the trees in their rows, all those crooked backs and gnarled hands. When the wind came, the branches clicked against each other like a conversation you weren't meant to hear. She had returned to Briar Hollow because her grandmother had died in May and her brother had asked. "A month," he'd said on the phone, the word elongated by a hopeful lie. "Just until I get the packing house cleaned up and we figure out if we're going to lease the upper rows." But June slid into July, July into August, and the rain began. The house kept its own calendar, and it didn't much care about hers. The phone rang, shrill in the quiet. It was one of those landlines that never truly died in houses like this. She wiped her hands on a dish towel stripped thin with use and answered. "Isabel." Matthew's voice was damp with static. "Do you hear it?" She cupped the receiver with her shoulder and looked back at the orchard. "Hear what?" "A knocking," he said, "on and off since sunset. It's in the house. Or under it." Matt. As if summoned by his naming, it came, not the scattered creaks of settling wood, but a rhythm. 3 thuds spaced like footsteps measured on a metronome. Then a pause that made the pause itself sound like a decision. And then 3 more thuds, each deep enough to shiver the spoons in their jar. Isabel felt her scalp prickle. She pressed the receiver hard to her ear. "Where are you?" "In the cellar," he said. "I was checking the sump. You should come down." He hesitated, and when he spoke again his voice had shortened, as if he'd bitten off the end of what he'd meant to say. "Just come down slow. Bring the big flashlight." Lightning washed the kitchen, a flat white. For a second she was only glare and shadow. For a second she was 2 Isabels, one inside and one outside in the glass. In the brief reflection she thought she saw, in the orchard behind her, a pale interruption among the trees. Not a person. Something more like the suggestion of a person. The flash died, and the dark returned fast, a door slamming. She caught herself leaning toward the window, as if it were a face she could read. The knock came again, closer, a muscular sound chewing up the space under her shoes. She turned from the window, crossed to the pegboard, and took the flashlight down. The wooden handle was polished by decades of Crowe hands. Her grandmother's voice entered her head in the way dead voices do when the weather's bad. "Don't name what's at the window. Don't speak to it unless you're ready to listen." She opened the cellar door and was met with breath, the steady wet exhalation of the earth. Her grandmother had called it the house's lungs. Steps appeared in the rectangle of dark like teeth in a mouth. She took them carefully, the boards swollen and groaning under her weight. The air grew colder. She smelled dirt and vinegar and damp rope. "Keep right," Matthew called up. "Left side slick." "Since when?" she asked, more to hear herself say something normal than because she needed the information. "Since the water started coming in." She reached the packed earth floor. Water tracked along the seam where wall met ground. The light from the single bare bulb swung in a draft, throwing moving ribs across the foundations. Matt stood near the middle, where the old fieldstone chimney stacked up through both stories. He had the pump open, its guts looking too bright and clean against all this brown. He glanced up, and in that glance she saw the boy he'd been, The 19-year-old who had kept the farm's books and the orchard's books and coaxed money out of bankers who didn't think the Crowes were serious people. It surprised her that the boy had aged into a man who could still be startled by the talking of a house. "Listen," he said softly. They listened. For a moment, all she heard was the gentle slap of water, the minute creak of the bulb, the tick of drip against concrete. Then, 3 slow thuds from the direction of the western wall. He turned his head like a dog. Isabel swept the flashlight. The beam caught shelves lined with jars, pear preserves clouded by time, a jar of buttons her grandmother had labeled with a year and nothing else, a row of nails sorted by size into reused mayonnaise jars with their labels scabbed away. It caught the storm freezer with its lid propped open and its interior beaded with wet like the inside of a mouth. It caught the low door set into the stone near the floor, no wider than a laundry basket, its wood dark with age, its iron hasp bright where it had been handled. The door's edge had swelled, and the swelling had bitten the soil, and the soil around it looked disturbed, as if someone had been pawing there. The thud arrived again, and this time she felt it travel up her shins. It came from the low door. She swallowed. "We never kept anything in there, did we?" "Nothing worth locking," Matt said, but his voice didn't stick to the words. He wiped his hands on his jeans and crouched near the door, his cheek muscle standing up against his beard like he'd clamped it there to keep from saying something he'd regret. "I only saw inside once. When I was little. After the barn fire," he said, not looking at her. "They used it to store what they didn't want to throw away in front of the neighbors." She saw the barn as it had been, red paint scabbed by weather, hayloft canted with the weight of old summers. She saw it in its burning, the black column of smoke, the hiss of green wood, their grandmother with her big hands around a hose, the water making a rainbow in the smoke like a joke God had told too early in the day. "What is they?" she asked. "Who is they?" He flicked the flashlight from his hand to hers and reached for the hasp. "You know who they is." He forced a smile that didn't get even halfway to his eyes. "Us. A different tense of us." The iron cried when he lifted it. He pressed his fingers in the seam and pulled. The lip came away with a wet sucking sound. Soil sloughed like flesh from the edge. A colder draft met them, the kind of basement cold that seems to come from a darker hour. The smell was not rot. It was something like turned leaves and something metallic, like old pennies held too long in the mouth. He had to seat his shoulder against the wood and lean. The door stuttered wide. Isabel involuntarily lifted the light higher, as if white could argue with dark. The space beyond was not tall. It was a crawl space dug into clay, braced with rough timber. The flashlight painted the ground into existence. Patches of broken brick. 2 bottles with their corks collapsed inward like drowned caps. A child's metal pail buckled on one side. In the back, the earth made a soft hump like someone had laid a body down and the dirt had grown to match it over time. "Don't," she said, but he'd already knelt to push the light deeper. Something moved. No, something chose not to be there anymore. The impression of it, then the absence. The light caught a surface that was not ground. Not smooth but planed, with a hairline running its length like a seam. "A box," Matt said. The word landed awkwardly. Or a chest. Isabel's throat dried. "Please don't open anything in a hole under the house at midnight during a storm. Sometimes the universe is trying to be clear." His laugh sounded like it belonged to someone who wanted the joke to end. "I'm not opening anything. I'm just..." He reached into the space, fingers grazing the seam, the light trembling a little as it colored his knuckles a sickly cream. "I just want to feel if it's wood or..." The knocking answered him. Not from the wall, not from the ground. It came from the chest. 3 knocks, measured, as if something inside were practicing patience. They froze. Her chest realized it had been breathing and then forgot how. She could hear the rain thickening above them, a hard new layer pasted over all the old ones. She was no longer sure about the distances in the room, whether she stood 2 feet from the door or across a field from it. "Okay," Matt said softly, to himself or to the house. He withdrew his hand. He pushed the door closed an inch and then another. "All right." Enough of that for tonight. He lowered the hasp. The iron fell into place with the definite satisfaction of objects doing what they'd always done. The air loosened by a degree, like a string slackening. They stood without speaking, and in that wordless minute old things had room to climb up the ladder of memory. She remembered the first time she'd thought the house disliked her. The way the bedroom door latched itself in winter, so she had to put her shoulder to it in the morning, so the house started the day by making her use the weight of her body against it. She remembered watching her grandmother knead dough and whisper not a prayer, but instructions to the bread, as if the bread were a dog that could be made to heel. "Isabel," Matthew said softly, the hush in his voice a new kind of caution. "You see why I called? Because something is knocking from a box in a hole under our house," she said, and heard the thinness of her own sarcasm. "Yes, I can see the appeal of a second opinion. I was going to call it the crawl space because that sounds less like a grave." "Call it whatever you want," she said. It knocked. He nodded, a slow, wrenching motion. "When it started, I thought the sump was choking. You know how the pipe can jump in its collar? But I cut the power and it kept going, only slower, like it was waiting for me to notice the rhythm. I thought, I'll get the flashlight, I'll see a raccoon weeping quietly about its life choices, and I'll feel both superior and sad. Then I saw." He gestured at the low door. "And I remembered the barn. And I remembered something else." "What?" He took a breath, as if what he was about to say required oxygen arranged a particular way. "Do you remember when grandmother got her cast off the summer you were 9 and I was 12? You helped her down the porch steps and she said, 'Good girl.' She never said that. She said good, like she feared wasting it.
Isabel smiled unwillingly.
She rationed sweetness like sugar during a war. She took me down here that summer," he said. "She told me there were rooms you did not open unless you wanted company. She said there were names that would make themselves known if you went looking for them. She made me hold a nail in my hand until it warmed to my skin, and then she told me to put it inside the low door, in the dirt."
"Payment," she said.
I asked, "For what?" She said, "For not counting us at night." He spread his hands, helpless. I didn't know what she meant, but I remember feeling like I had walked into a sentence she'd started before I was born. He gave a small snort and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. The draft through the seams of the stone raised the hair on Isabel's arms. She turned the flashlight off to save the battery, and the cellar became that fuzzy blackness that shows you shapes you hope are your own. "Let's go up," she said. "We'll lock the cellar. We'll..." She groped for plausible verbs softened by rationality. "We'll put a chair against the door, like in a college dorm. You can call a contractor in the morning. They can deal with the box, or sealing the crawl space, or whatever the right word is for sealing luck away." He didn't move. "You saw something in the orchard when the lightning came." It wasn't a question. The skin at the back of her neck drew tight. "I don't know what I saw." "Say it anyway." "A shape where a tree wasn't," she said. "A patch of wrong color. It felt like being looked at with someone else's eyes behind your eyes." They climbed. The steps had a particular count to them that every Crow learned before they learned to tie their shoes. The kitchen felt overlit, too yellow, suddenly domestic to the point of insult. In the reflection on the window, there were 2 tired people and the messy life they had arranged on the counters. Printouts with numbers circled and stabbed by pens, mugs going cold, a pie their neighbor had left that neither of them had touched because it meant saying thank you, and saying thank you meant admitting something was wrong. The rain fell as if distance were a rumor. The orchard held its breath. A wind came and pressed its hands to the house. "Do not," Isabel said to herself, not even intending the words to be said aloud. "Do not go to the back door. Do not go out on the steps." She went to the back door and went out on the steps. The hollow of night wrapped her. The porch light spread its small radius. Beyond that, the orchard began. It was not a border so much as a tide line. Inside the light, there was the step and the tub of dead rosemary and the blue mat that had always said welcome even when nobody meant it. Outside the light, the orchard thought its long thoughts. Something metallic chimed against itself in the wind. Perhaps the chain on the gate, perhaps the hook on the Apple Watch. She brought the flashlight up but did not turn it on. She didn't want the beam to announce her, to say, "I am over here," pointed and pinning. She stood, trying to feel with her skin what she couldn't see. The orchard had moods. In summer, it could be benevolent and stupid with heat, a bear's back scratched against bark. In winter, it could be skeletal and exact. In rain like this, it felt like a jury. "Hey," Matthew said behind her, not yet on the steps, voice quieted so as not to irritate the dark. "Don't wander." "We're not the wanderers," she said. "We're the fixed point. That's the problem." "You hear that?" he asked. "What?" He didn't answer for a moment. She understood why. Naming it made it kneel up and look at you. Then he said, "There's a change in the rain. It's hitting something that wasn't there a minute ago." He moved beside her. They stood shoulder to shoulder the way they had as kids when a strange car came up the drive. Then she heard it. Not louder than the rain, but distinct within it, like a second hand ticking inside a clock you thought was purely digital. A soft, erratic knocking from under the porch. Then a pause, and then a friendlier knock from a little farther away. Then, as if they had agreed on a tempo, a third from the orchard, dull as if delivered by a padded hand. A laugh rose in her throat. A humorless little bark her body, made to try to keep her inside her skin. "We don't need this," she said to the night. "We have enough." The knocking stopped, as if she had offended it. The rain resumed as only rain. The silence that followed wasn't silence. It was the sound a place makes after deciding to wait you out. "Okay," Matt said, and breathed in like he was taking in the cooler from the truck or shouldering a post, doing the ordinary heavy thing that keeps a place going. "We close the cellar. We go room to room. We make sure the windows are latched. We don't name anything in the orchard. We don't speak to anything under the house." "You sound like her," Isabel said, not unkindly. He scrubbed a hand over his jaw. "I hear her when the weather's like this." He nodded toward the kitchen. "Come on." They did the tour. The house accepted it with the bored tolerance of an old animal. They checked the sitting room where the braided rug had faded into zones that mapped the chairs they'd sat in most. They checked the front hall with its row of family faces looking permanent and exhausted, the frames slightly crooked from the house's old, slow slouch. They checked the pantry, where the smell of onion skins lived like a stubborn tenant. They checked the parlor, which had never quite recovered from being a room where the dead were displayed. Matt put the cellar latch down and slid the chain. "Do you think we should call someone?" he asked finally. "Who fits in that sentence?" she asked back. "Who comes when you say, 'Our house is knocking from underneath'?" "A plumber with a minor in ritual studies," he said, and the joke died between them, not of lack of effort, but because it had nowhere humane to live. She made coffee because the act of making coffee declared a republic inside whatever empire night built. Steam rose. The kettle whistled. The knock did not return, but the paused shape of it hung in the room as if the room had adapted its geometry to include a waiting. They sat at the old table where so many crows had learned how to budget on paper that looked like battlefield maps. "I had a dream last night," Isabel said finally. "That's not evidence." "I know that, but I had a dream." Matt wrapped his hands around his mug and waited, which was one of his powers. He could make stillness feel like conversation. "In the dream, I was sitting where I am now," she said, "and the orchard wasn't out there. There was a road with stores, bright windows like little mouths. The house had moved into town, into a row of houses, and our house didn't know how to be a neighbor. It kept shrinking and expanding like a lung. People walked by and looked at us with the faces you make at a dog behind a fence. And then I looked down at the table, and there were pits on it like the surface of the moon. I picked one up. It wasn't a pit. It was a tooth. And I realized I was counting them without meaning to." He nodded without surprise. "Grandmother and the counting," he said. "She used to throw a handful of rice on the threshold on New Year's. Said it's rude to give the night a simple number. I think she threw it so she'd hear if something came in," Isabel said. Not because she believed it, but because the sentence felt like a place to rest. Little feet, little rolls. The clock on the stove began to blink 12 o'clock as if the storm had nudged the power briefly out of joint. They watched that for a while, the way you watch a fire or a hospital monitor, for the narrative it hints at, for the way it ignores you. The phone rang again. Not like before, sharper, as if the bell inside had sharpened itself across a file while they weren't looking. The caller ID said unknown, which in Briar Hollow could mean anything from a neighbor with a new landline to an outside world peering in like a child through a bakery window. Matt reached for it. Isabel put a hand on his wrist. They looked at each other, and both rolled their eyes at their own superstition. He pressed the button. "Crowe Place," he said, because that was how the older men answered, and sometimes speaking in their voices brought some of their borrowed spine with it. No one spoke at first. Then a breath, and then a voice that was tinny and a little far away, the kind of voice you get when someone calls you from a place the phone companies never intended people to live. It was a woman's voice, older but not fragile.
"Don't open it," the voice said.
Matt's face emptied out so. Completely she saw boy again. "Who is this?" "Don't open it," the woman said again, the exact same cadence. Then the line crackled and the call ended, not with a click, but with the loss of a presence. They stared at the receiver as if it were capable of guilt. He set it down gently, as if putting a heavy thing to bed. "I'm choosing to dislike that," Isabel said, and her mouth felt like a tool she'd never used before. "Could be a prank," he said, without any conviction. "From who?" "A teenager with a gift of stage direction." He stood and paced to the window and back as if any one direction would be disloyal to the others. "Okay. In the morning I'll get someone out here. Pete knows a guy who does crawl spaces and critters. We'll tell him there's a chest. We won't tell him it knocked. We'll let him think we're regular people with a regular problem, and we'll pay him money like money can pay for anything." She nodded. "We go to bed with our shoes by the door." He looked at her, startled, and then smiled in a way that was more confession than humor. "You hear her too," he said. "Her lists." "She didn't teach me to bake a decent crust," Isabel said, "but she taught me how to go to bed when the night disagrees with you." They turned off the lights in an order that made sense to the house. The dark rearranged itself accommodatingly. She stood in the doorway of the guest room that had become hers. The wallpaper's rose pattern had faded in a way that suggested roses remembered better than people did. The bed creaked, giving her news of its springs. She left the door ajar, the way you do when you want to pretend you are not alone. She lay on her side and listened. The rain performed its patient work. The house reviewed its grievances in old joints. Between the sounds, something like thought moved. She did not sleep exactly. She stepped into a hallway where all the doors were closed and she walked it, and when she reached the end she turned and walked it back. Sometime around the hour that feels like subtraction, the knocking returned. Not from below, from the far end of the hallway, beyond Matthew's room, where the staircase turned and the attic door lived like a secret. 3 knocks. Slow. As if what delivered them had learned the house during the time it had waited. She sat up, and in the sitting all the old children inside her sat up too. The girls who had slept here on storm nights and made bargains with corners. The girl who had counted breaths to make sure they kept happening. She swung her feet into her shoes and stood viciously quiet, as if stepping softly were the only protest she had left. In the other room, a low sound, Matt waking with his mouth closed. A floorboard sighed as he stood. They met in the hall like soldiers who didn't know they were on the same side until they found each other's faces in the gloom. "Do you?" he began. "Yes," she said. They turned their heads toward the attic end, as if the dark had spoken their names politely. The third knock came a little quicker this time, almost shy. Together, without planning it, they moved toward it. Not because they wanted to, and certainly not because they believed anything good waited there, but because the house had told them the night had an order, and their feet understood old orders better than their minds did. They reached the stair that made the turn. The attic door, painted the lavatory green someone in the 1970s must have found virtuous, stood closed. The brass knob was dull, where it wasn't brightened by old thumbs. Their grandmother had kept the attic a room of keeps, the literal keep of the house, where you didn't go unless it invited you. It had not invited, not once, since May. The knocking did not repeat. It had made its introduction, and was content to see if they'd remember their manners. They looked at each other. Neither reached for the knob. Both of them, almost at the same moment, stepped back. They did not run. They walked to their rooms like people who had nothing pressing to do. The house watched them, reconciled for now. Isabel sat on the edge of the bed until the sitting became a kind of sleeping. In that gray place she saw the orchard again, but in the version of it that belonged not to land or season but to the room behind your eyes. Every tree lit from within as if its heart had become a lantern, and between those trunks a path made not by feet but by intention. A child's pail lay on the path, buckled. Something knocked from far away, and the sound learned her name as it traveled. At dawn, or at the hour when the rain lightens because day has taken something from it, she woke to the smell of coffee and to the sound of the back door easing open. She went careful down the hall, careful down the stairs, and came to the kitchen in time to see Matt step into the yard with his boots unlaced and his jaw set. "Wait," she said, not loudly, but she said it the way you say a word to a dog that knows the tone more than the vocabulary. He stopped and looked back. She saw that he had not slept at all, that he was simply the kind of tired that keeps moving because the alternative is acknowledging you are already beyond the point where rest does any good. "I'm just checking the sump again," he said. "And the gate latch. And the—" He gestured vaguely at the mechanics of a life. "I'll come," she said. They stepped out into the soft morning. The rain had given up its tantrum for a steady drip. Mist held the orchard in a gauze that made the trunks look like the bones of larger animals. The earth's skin had gone black and shiny, here and there the grass stuck up like wet eyelashes. They walked to the cellar hatch first because that was the most obvious place to pretend the world made sense. The chain held. The padlock held. The wood swelled in its frame like a muscle at rest. The house smelled of damp stone and apple breath and something else, a sweetness like sugar that had melted and been rehardened. "After coffee," Matt said, as if making an appointment with himself so he'd keep it, "I'll call Pete's guy." "After coffee," she agreed, and turned toward the orchard because they both had to, or else the orchard would feel flattered. The rows ran away into the mist, a grammar they'd been taught to parse and had never fully learned. The first tree wore a scrap of red twine, a mark someone, maybe Matt, had made months ago to say this one needs attention. The twine flickered in the weak wind. Beneath the tree, in the place where the grass had thinned to a scab of earth, there was a dark patch round as a dinner plate. Isabel crouched because crouching made objects reveal themselves. The dark patch was water-pooled in a shallow depression. In the center of the water, a nailhead showed, the iron gone the color of old tea. She reached to touch it and then didn't. "There were nails in the crawl space," she said. "There are nails everywhere," he said, but softly, as if disagreeing too strongly would trigger something's defense. They straightened. The mist drifted. The rows opened a little and then drew their skirts again. Farther in, something pale waited. Not white, not cloth, not bark. A shape like a handkerchief forgotten on the ground, the way a handkerchief looks after it has been clenched in a fist, and then let go. Isabel lifted the flashlight, and for the first time used it in the morning, the beam cutting a clean stitch through the gray. The pale patch did not brighten. The light found it and lost it at once, the way light does when it hits bone just under skin. They did not walk toward it. They stood and let the rain erase a little more of what the night had written. They listened because that was all that seemed like language anymore. From beneath the boards at their feet, under the porch, under the threshold, the knocking resumed. Slow as a heartbeat counted by someone who had never been hurried. 3 strokes. A pause. 3 more. "Don't open it," Isabel said softly, but she didn't know which door she meant now, or which of the house's mouths would answer if she asked. They turned toward the kitchen, toward the coffee, toward the idea of making a call in a daylight that felt like alone. The orchard let them go without comment. The house received them with the rude frankness of the living. On the table, where there had been their mugs and the pie and the bills, something new had made a wet mark, 3 dark circles drying to rings, as if someone had set down 3 small cups of water and lifted them again carefully, very carefully, so as not to be impolite. Isabel reached out and put her fingers in one of the circles. The wood was damp, but not cold. It held the same confused warmth as a nail that's been cupped in the hand for a long time. She looked at Matt and saw her own face in the shine of his eyes. Not frightened in the old childish way, but complicatedly awake. "After coffee," he said again, and this time the words sounded like a prayer disguised as an errand. The knocking, polite and patient, waited under the floorboards, counting them in a measure it had brought from below. The house listened. The orchard leaned in. The day started anyway, because days do, and in that beginning there was the sense of a season testing the doors of a life, finding what latched and what wanted to open. Chapter 2: The Orchard Breathes. The coffee cooled in uneven rings, and the rings dried to faint halos that looked like cautions left behind by careful hands. Isabel ran a finger through one and felt how the wood held a whisper of warmth, the way a palm keeps the memory of a nail pressed into it. Matt made a list on the back of an envelope in his staccato print: gloves, masks, flashlight batteries, masonry anchors, one new hasp, and circled each item as if the roundness could seal their morning shut against what the night had opened. The rain had settled into a patient fall, less drama now, more decision. The orchard behind the glass had turned from a single black mass to a map of interlocking shapes, trunks with old lightning scars, a ladder forgotten against a tree 2 rows in, an aluminum wash table tilted so its basin caught the sky and held a second, smaller weather. The pale smudge Isabel had seen at first light had vanished into the gray. She didn't trust vanishing. It was what things did when they wanted to continue their work unobserved. "Let's go before daylight gets ideas," Matt said, and the phrase was something their grandmother would have said, a rural grammar that made weather and light into neighbors who needed handling. They pulled on boots left by the back door to dry and never quite did. The porch boards gave a small sigh under their weight, the house acknowledging them with a sound that was not affection but recognition. On the way to the truck, Isabel paused by the first tree, the one with the red twine. The twine had weathered to a chalky pink. A single apple, the size of a fist, hung high and out of reach, its skin oddly matte, as if it had been dusted with ash. Below it, the ground held a shallow pool, and the nail head at its center had darkened to a bruise. She couldn't tell if the water had collected around the nail or if the nail had collected the water. "Don't pick at the scabs," Matt called from the truck with a half smile that didn't live in his eyes. "I'm just counting," she said, and then realized the word she'd chosen. "Never mind. I'm coming." The road and the hollow. The road into Briar Hollow wasn't long, but it had a way of stretching when the sky was low, as if distance were elastic and weather knew how to pull it. The fields on either side were a patchwork of pasture and rough meadow, dotted with round bales wrapped in white plastic that made the landscape look as if someone had scattered giant eggs and then forgotten to hatch them. Here and there, old stone walls wandered through the grass like lines on a palm, telling futures that could only be read by hand. The truck cab held the faithful stale smell of small rural machines, oil and damp denim and the ghost of hay. The windshield wipers wrote their slow essays. On the radio, a local station murmured farm reports and the weather in a tone that suggested the announcer was personally disappointed by the rain's stubbornness. Between sentences, there was a soft click, like a tongue counting teeth. "You remember when the church bell used to sound out the hour," Matt said suddenly, "and you swore it skipped the 4? "I didn't swear," she said. "I counted, and it skipped the 4. He grinned, and for a moment boyhood laid its brief, clean light over his face. "Old man Poulsen said you can't skip 4. Said it's not possible. Bell ropes don't care about superstition. Then maybe it skipped us," she said, and he made a little hum that meant he'd pocketed the thought for later. They crested the low hill and the town appeared, the way towns do here, not dramatically, but with the inevitability of a sentence reaching its verb. Briar Hollow had one real intersection and several that pretended. A mural on the side of the feed store showed apples painted, as if they were trying very hard to be cheerful about their fate. The coffee shop, which had been a barber shop, displayed a chalkboard out front with a joke about lattes that made Isabel wince on behalf of humor. The post office door, predictably, stuck. Someone was already applying their shoulder to it as they passed. They parked outside Emery Hardware, where the letters of Emery had once been gold-leafed, and were now the honest color of neglect. A single plastic broom leaned in the window like a patient who'd already decided to survive. Inside, the air smelled of oil, rope, and the sweet dust of old cardboard. The floorboards had the furred look of softwood that's been trod by serious shoes for a century. The bell over the door said a small bright thing about arrivals. Gus Emery looked up from his stool on the counter, his pencil tucked behind his ear and his newspaper folded to the horoscopes. Well, he said, the words as dry as a field in March. 2 crows at once. The hollow will think it's Christmas. We're not singing, Matt said, dropping a polite handshake on the counter. Gus's eyes cut to Isabel and then back to the envelope in Matt's hand. What do you need and what do you think you need are 2 different lists, but let's start with the one you wrote. Matt read off items, and for each Gus disappeared into aisles that were more logic than geometry. He returned with gloves stiff as language, masks and bags that whispered, a canister of desiccant pellets with a skull and bones printed so faintly you had to squint to be properly warned. He produced a hasp that would have done proud duty on a small pirate chest. Overkill, Matt said. Is there another kind? Gus said, and when he set the hasp down, he left his hand on it. You 2 smell tired. Not the kind sleep fixes. Isabel tried on a shrug. House is old. Rain makes it complain. Gus said. Old houses like to talk. And then, as if he were turning a page in a book they'd all read too many times, he said, saw Mrs. Hovel at the diner this morning. She said your grandmother's pears beat the orchards last season by 3 pounds per tree. Impossible, Matt said, quick and fond. She's lying to keep the world in the shape she recognizes. That's what telling is, Gus said. You don't have to believe every measure to respect the teller. He put a hand flat on the countertop and peered at Matt from under his eyebrows. You've been hearing anything you don't want to respect? Raccoons under the porch, Matt said, too evenly. Sure, Gus said. Raccoons that knock polite. Tell them I said hello, and to keep off my tomatoes. He winked as if he could afford to, then tallied the receipt by hand, pencil adding decisions in gray graphite. When Matt reached for his wallet, Gus paused and touched the envelope with the list. You crows ever find that box after the barn burned? What box? Isabel asked before she could help herself. Gus blinked once, slow as a cow. The one your great-granddad said was missing from the loft. He made a fuss like a man makes when he knows fuss is the only tool he has left. Made a list of what it held and read it at the Grange, he added, almost gently. Names, dates, weights. Said a family needs to know what it has been measured by. He handed the receipt over as if it were a scrap from a hymnal. You be careful with your measurements. Outside, the air had warmed into a kind of wet wool. I hate the way people in this town open their mouths, Isabel said, and all our ghosts come out. You like it, Matt said, not unkindly. It means the dead carry part of the load. They tossed the supplies into the truck cab and crossed to the diner because not eating felt like an insult to the basic contract that held day together. The bell on the door sang a single bright note. The diner smelled of coffee, bacon fat, and a lemon cleaner that suggested someone here still believed in the power of surfaces. Locals watched them in the practiced way of towns that have been told long stories by certain families and are waiting for new chapters they can be trusted with. They slid into a booth with a cracked red seat. A waitress with a braid and an expression of stalwart mercy wrote their orders without small talk. At the counter, a woman in a blue cardigan cut her pancakes into precise squares, then stacked the squares in little towers before eating them one by one. The radio above the grill played a song that sounded like a memory of summer, held together by 3 chords and stubbornness. Look, Matt said lightly, nodding toward the corkboard by the bathrooms. The board held missing dog notices, a flyer for a church bake sale, a hand-lettered ad offering tractor repairs, honest. Between those, a typed sheet with a phone number and the words estate clean out, discreet. Someone had written in ballpoint under discreet, define discreet. Someone else had written under that, he means he won't tell you what he takes. The phone number had tear-off tabs. Most were gone. Let's not need those, Isabel said. Let's not, he agreed. They ate eggs and toast as if the fork could anchor them into the polite geography of daylight. The toast tasted like every diner's toast, a communion of blandness that had kept thousands of mornings in one piece. As Isabel buttered the second slice, her knife ticked against a hard crumb. She looked down. 3 poppy seeds had fallen onto the plate in a neat little triangular arrangement. She went to brush them away and found that her hand had already counted them. She put the knife down. Do you ever feel like certain numbers arrive with their own faces? 2 is a pair of stubborn mules, Matt said without missing a beat. 4 is a square that doesn't trust you. 3 is a knocking. She breathed out a laugh too thin to stand up, and they let the subject fall, because you could get yourself laughed out of a diner for less. At the register, Mrs. Hovell herself emerged from the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder and a face that had been carved for honesty and then taught discretion. You too, she said. Your grandmother's pear tart could have ended wars. She ended some small ones, Matt said, and they felt together the ache of the bright, simple sentence they wanted to say. She's gone. And the duller, truer one the town already knew. She is not done with us. On the way out, the bell rang once, and then decided against it. The quiet house that isn't. The drive back took less time, because the truck had learned its way through the rain. The fields looked like they were thinking with their mouths open. As the farmhouse came into view, the back porch hunched like a shoulder blade, the kitchen window a blunt eye, Isabel felt a small tug at her collarbone, like a child's hand reminding her not to walk too fast. Something in the yard had shifted the way a room shifts after you've put a chair back in exactly the same place, but it knows you've touched it. The porch mat had rotated a quarter turn. The rosemary tub they'd left next to the door had migrated closer to the steps, leaving a dark arc, a wet footprint. That said, it had not moved itself. On the kitchen table, visible through the window, the 3 faint halos from the coffee had been joined by a 4th, out of alignment with the others, as if someone had set a cup down while standing. Matt unlocked the back door with care that verged on ceremony. The door stuck as always and then relented, as if shamed by insistence. The kitchen smelled a little sweeter than it had, like a jar of preserves opened in the next room. Did you? Isabel began. I didn't, he said, already pulling open drawers, already checking where they had left each small domestic thing. The teaspoons had been rearranged into 2 precise rows. A pencil that had lived near the phone for 10 years had rolled itself perpendicular to the phone's base. The pie, still untouched, had shifted a centimeter to the right. The glaze had smudged the plate with the faintest drag mark. These were not crimes. They were courtesies performed by someone who did not want to be accused of intruding. In the hall, the clock that had blinked 12 o'clock all night had revised itself to 9:37 without ever showing the climb. Isabel ran her finger along the wall and came away with a clean line on her skin, as if the surface had been polished by something passing that cared about etiquette. Okay, Matt said, not convincing anyone. Wind. House breath. The usual. Sure, Isabel said. Polite wind. Meticulous breath. He pocketed the new hasp and the anchors and set the gloves on the cellar door like an offering. Rick's due at noon, he said. If the universe has a sense of timing, he'll show up while we're not in the cellar. The universe is a union man, she said. He takes lunch early. They toured the main floor as if they were prospective buyers looking for cracks to negotiate with. In the sitting room, the braided rug had raised one edge. Isabel knelt to smooth it and found 3 apple seeds tucked under the curl, lined up like a punctuation mark she didn't recognize. She left them there. In the front hall, one of the family photographs, the one of their great-grandparents in their wedding finery, the bride's face already wearing the patient expression of someone who knows the farm will ask twice what she has, had straightened itself on the wall. It looked almost jaunty, a lean of the living toward the dead. They were in the parlor, avoiding the stretch of floorboards that sang, when they heard the rattle of a truck in the drive. It arrived with the modest roar of a man who wanted to be sure you knew he was coming, but didn't want to frighten your animals. The dog that wasn't there didn't bark. The house tamped its internal noises down, the way a classroom quiets when a substitute teacher enters. Rick and the Crowe. Rick was younger than Isabel had pictured, a 30s that had worked hard at its own survival. He had the easy belly of a man who ate breakfast like an obligation to good sense. The cigarette behind his ear was unlit, and she realized with a small private relief that she'd never seen him with one lit. It was a habit, not an appetite. "Raccoons under the porch," he announced cheerfully, as if confirming a diagnosis he didn't believe in. Or skunks. Or the memory of raccoons. "I've seen worse memories than skunks." Isabel held the cellar door. "We were hearing something." "Sure," Rick said equably, ducking his head as he began down the stairs. Houses have opinions. In the cellar, the air held tight to its dam. Rick paused halfway down and inhaled through his nose like a hound that had grown up around libraries. "That's not rot," he said. "That's tin. That's pennies. That's HM." He reached the packed earth and bent toward the low door. "You don't mind if I pop this?" "Please do not pop anything," Isabel said, then cleared her throat. "I mean, be careful." "My wife says that word doesn't mean what I think it does," Rick said, and winked at her in a way that, against the evidence of the world, felt like an ally's little hand signal. He ran his gloved fingers along the edge and made a small approving sound. "Someone's kept this half-spoiled. Someone's been opening and closing this door in the last year." "We haven't," Matt said. "Not since," he didn't finish the month. Rick nodded as if months were a private shame. He eased the hasp up, braced a shoulder, and inched the door open. The suction of wet wood released with a familiar obscene sigh. Cold air breathed out, polite but unmistakable, and with it came that metallic hint and something else, something like bruised greenery, like weeds crushed under a boot heel. "Stay back," Rick said without condescension. Sometimes animals charge toward light, not away. Isabel held the flashlight in both hands. The beam cut into the crawl space and laid its thin coin of brightness over rough timbers and clay the color of old blood. The things they'd seen earlier sketched themselves again. The collapsed bottles, the buckled child's pail, the broken brick teeth. The hump at the rear, darker now, more definite. The shape that had only been suggestion before resolved under the light into lines. A long rectangle with a seam and a ghost of a handle. The wood looked pale where it wasn't dark, as if it had been planed and then forgotten in a long, damp silence. "There," Rick said, his voice kneeling. "That's not animal work." "Don't open it," Isabel whispered without deciding to speak. "Not planning to," Rick said, expression tightening. "Just looking." He lay on his side and wormed his shoulders into the space, moving like a man who had taught his body which fears to ignore. The flashlight's beam wobbled and then steadied as he took it from Isabel. She stood with her hands out, fingers curved around nothing, as if she were still holding the light and could help by intention alone. "Fresh dig marks," Rick called softly. "See here?" Someone scooped and patted and scooped again. "This soil's been turned in the last few months, weeks if it's kept this wet." He touched the flank of the rectangular thing, and the beam glared back from a small nail head sunk flush in the wood. "It's nailed shut," he said, and then made a little sound that wasn't fear, exactly, but respect pretending to be humor. You don't nail a thing shut unless you want to be sure it keeps its opinions to itself. The knocking arrived. 3 deliberate, measured thuds from the exact center of the rectangular thing. It was not loud. The clay took the sound and ate most of it. But it was the way a heartbeat sounds when you put your ear to a chest you're not sure is alive. As the 3rd thud faded, a second sound rose behind it, a slow exhalation from somewhere in the dark, like air being traded between 2 rooms for the first time in a long time. Rick went very still. He turned his head toward the sound but didn't otherwise move, an animal at the waterline scenting something it doesn't have a name for. "Okay," he said quietly, as if addressing a child who might spook. "Okay, I hear you." "Come out," Isabel said, because the skin at the back of her neck had tightened into a fist. "Please." "I'm not popping anything," Rick said again, but this time it wasn't a joke. He pushed himself back inch by inch, the clay printing its coolness on his jacket. When his boots cleared the threshold, he sat up and took the mask off his face, the elastic snapping his ear. He looked older by a year than he had going in. That, he said conversationally, isn't wildlife. What do you think it is? Matt asked, both too quickly and with too much softness, the way you speak to someone whose diagnosis you already fear. I think it's not my job, Rick said, not unkindly. I pull raccoons. I evict skunks. I do not pry up lids on boxes that learn to breathe in the dark. You could just, Matt began. Sir, Rick said, and the word landed with an almost tender firmness. You want me to take a crowbar to a nailed-down thing that knocks 3 times like a neighbor at a back door? If I put my bar under that lip and that knocking stops, what story am I in? If it starts up faster, what story are you in? Isabel surprised herself by sitting down on the cellar step. It wasn't that her knees had given. It was that the ground had asked politely if it could be higher than she was for a moment, and she had said yes. So what now? She asked the dirt, the door, the decades. We let it be? For the hour, Rick said. For the day. For as long as it takes to think like people and not like fear. There are folks who handle history. He rubbed a clay smear on his forearm, as if it were a thought he could erase. Old boxes. Old families. Old arrangements. I can give you a number. It's not on a corkboard. Matt's mouth did a small, stubborn thing. We don't need. We might, Isabel said, gently enough that it was not winning, exactly, but he stopped. She'd seen that look in him before, the Crowe male refusal to outsource trouble. It had made men in this house try to lift what it would have been kinder to brace. Rick took a small notebook from his jacket like a man performing a sacrament and wrote a name and a number on a page he tore as carefully as anyone has ever torn paper. He handed it to Isabel without drama. If you call her use my name, he said, she'll start by charging too much and end by charging exactly what it's worth. Who? Matt asked. Woman named Linnea Hart, he said. People call her a historian when they want to be polite and other things when they don't. She knows how to ask a house to tell the long version. She also knows when to stop asking. Isabel folded the paper and felt, as she did, the odd conviction that the little square now had weight disproportionate to itself, like a coin you've promised to spend on the right thing. From the crawl space, as if to object to being scheduled, the knocking came again. This time it was softer, not timid but testing. 3 beats. A pause long enough for the cellar bulb to hum the distance. A 4th, like a child adding a note it knows will be forgiven for its boldness. Rick stood. That's me, he said. I'll invoice you for an opinion and a refusal. You want me to add a new hasp to your cellar hatch out back? It'll make you feel better for as long as that sort of thing makes people feel better. Yes, Matt said, too fast. Rick installed the hasp with a craftsman's brisk affection, the screech of his driver a crude but comforting sound in the soft weather. He made a second recommendation in that same easy voice, desiccant bags in the corners, a shallow trench to shift groundwater, and promised to bring a man next week who could cut a French drain if the ground would stop swallowing its own edges. At the door, he paused and looked past them into the kitchen as if cataloging a set of gentle harms. If you get the call again, he said, and the voice says don't open it, listen. There's wisdom in women who speak, as if they're telling you something you already knew. How did you? Matt began, but Rick was already stepping into the soft noon, his truck considering the puddles with an old animal's disdain. The town's memory, the house's mouth. Linnea Hart, Matt said, when the truck's noise had made itself scarce. That's a hobbyist with a newsletter. Then we'll be polite to her hobby, Isabel said, rinsing her hands as if the water could edit the morning into phrases the day might tolerate. Also, Gus asked about a box our great-grandfather read a list about at the Grange. I'd like to know if we're repeating a story or walking into its later chapters. He hesitated, caught between the farm's plain arithmetic and the house's new grammar. Then he nodded, a decision you could have missed if you weren't the person built to see his small nods. Call her, he said. Before she could, the phone rang. Not the cell on the counter, the landline. The bell inside it made that slightly too bright sound of metal ready to be told what to do. A no number displayed, as if the phone took a dim view of names. They looked at each other long enough to give the ring a personality. On the fourth peal, Isabel lifted the receiver. "Crowe Place," she said, "because that's how men said it, and sometimes you borrow the mask nearest at hand." A click, a quiet, then the same woman's voice as the night before, the edge of distance in it, as if sound were a long hallway she had to walk down to reach them. "Don't open it," the voice said, and Isabel could hear perfectly that the cadence was the same, the sentence placed on the same rails, the breath before it measured in the same way. "Who are you?" Isabel asked, finding her voice sitting shyly in a corner and bringing it forward. "How do you know what's under a house?" The woman breathed once, and Isabel had the uncanny sense of a hand smoothing a skirt before sitting. "I know what your grandmother knew," she said, "and I know she would have called me herself if she'd had time to teach you which cupboards are polite to leave closed. Sometimes families keep their mouths shut until the cupboard learns to speak for itself." "Are you," Matt began, leaning toward the phone, "Linnea Hart?" A small laugh, not unkind. "Not today," the woman said gently, and the line didn't so much hang up as cease continuing. The dial tone came like a small white flag. "Could be a prank," Matt said by reflex. "It could," Isabel said, "and so could rain." They went to work, because work is the fence you put around a day to keep it from wandering off. Matt measured the hatch for the trench. Isabel sorted the gloves, set the desiccant bags in corners, then found herself standing in the parlor with the family photographs because she had walked there without intention and the house had permitted it. She studied the faces like she could reach into them and pull a thread that would neaten the present. Great-Granda Crowe, standing too square, his hand on his bride's sleeve rather than her hand. A child in a white dress on a porch that wasn't this one but was kin to it. An old woman with eyes like two intelligent shadows. In the far left of one frame, a picnic scene where everyone had tilted their hats the same way as if directed. There was a smear that might have been light or might have been a trick of film. It wore, if you let it, the unfashionable shape of a person. She turned and looked at the ceiling because something up there had decided to remind her it was above. A faint creak traveled across the bones of the house. Not footsteps exactly. The sound of weight remembering itself. "Not today," she said aloud, and the floor under her feet made a dry popping sound as if in answer, a small agreement disguised as refusal. The orchard in daylight. In the early afternoon, the rain thinned to the kind of drizzle that sits down when it is tired and refuses to move. The light, which had been the gray of unmade silver, improved to pewter. "Walk," Isabel said, because sometimes the orchard asked you to look at it to keep it from thinking you'd forgotten who owned who. They took the middle row, the one their grandmother had called the family's backbone. The ground held water in its shallow dips and showed the scuffed prints of boots that weren't theirs running toward the wash table and back, as if someone had paced listening to their own decisions. Once, they passed a cluster of feathers too neatly arranged to be an accident, a white rosette pinned to the black earth with a thorn. Once, Isabel saw at the base of a tree 3 apple stems laid parallel like tally marks. She stepped over them because she had learned you do not interrupt someone else's counting without paying for the privilege. "Do you ever think," Matt said, "that the orchard needed us to be older before it would show us how it tells time?" "I think the orchard was clocking us before we could count," she said, and paused by a tree whose trunk had split into a low, elegant V. Something had been nailed into the V long ago, then pried out. The scar of it made a perfect oval, smooth as a worn coin. In the oval, someone had recently rubbed ash. Her own breath shortened. "Look." In the ash, a faint print, 3 small circles in a line, then a 4th set slightly apart, as if a careful, damp finger had pressed and pressed again. "Kids," Matt said, and even he didn't make it convincing. On the far side of the same tree, a loop of ribbon had been tied low and hidden, a pale remnant of something that didn't belong to farm work. When she tugged it free, it broke at once, leaving a soft ghost on her palm. It smelled faintly of lavender and rain. The ribbon's frayed end had been cut cleanly, not torn. They reached the fence that marked the orchard's top edge and looked out over the low field where the creek cut its sloppy S. The creek had swollen, licked at its banks, and then settled again with the mild arrogance of water. On the far bank, something pale caught the eye, then refused to be found. Isabel lifted the flashlight because habit makes instruments of us, but she didn't turn it on. Light in daytime has the hubris of sermonizing at a funeral. Let's go back, Matt said in a voice the orchard obeyed, without admitting it had done so. The historian who answers. Back in the kitchen, the paper with Linnea Hart's name sat on the table like a rune they had chosen to believe in. Isabel dialed, and the phone made that old mechanical series of tiny agreements. The ring sounded like it was crossing seas. After 2, a voice answered, "This is Linnea." The voice was low and amused in a way that suggested amusement was a tool she kept sharpened for use. There was no question in it. She had answered as if she knew who called and why. "This is the Crowe place," Isabel said, and surprised herself by the steadiness of her own voice.
Isabel.
"Matthew, we were given your number by Rick." "Who did not open something," Linnea said, and in that sentence Isabel heard, faintly, the clink of a teacup on its saucer, the soft friction of a page being turned.
Good.
"I don't enjoy working after men with pry bars and apologies." "We're not men with pry bars," Matt said, a little defensively. "No," Linnea said politely. "You are crows who waited a night too long to call me, and a generation longer than you ought to have to ask your grandmother the questions she wanted very much to answer. But here we are, and the calendar forgives no one." A rustle, perhaps of paper. "Tell me your 3 most recent facts." Isabel glanced at Matt. "The house has been rearranging itself by degrees small enough to be manners," she said. "There's a box under the crawl space. It knocks 3 times, sometimes 4. And the orchard?" Linnea asked. "It has opinions," Matt said before Isabel could decide which truth to tell. "It always did," Linnea said, and now her voice softened into the register of a woman half remembering her own time in a place that had stamped her. "Go to the parlor," she said. "Stand in front of the wedding photograph. Tell me how many faces are in it if you count the reflection in the window." Isabel's skin prickled. "You know the room?" "I know rooms that accommodate the dead," Linnea said. "And I know the Crowe photographer liked a window behind him. Humor me." They went to the parlor. The late afternoon had arranged itself over the room like a doily. The wedding photograph showed the couple and the handful of stern relations arranged, as if they were a fence erected against future weather. Behind the photographer, a small lace-curtained window reflected a soft square of the yard.
Isabel. Counted out loud, without meaning to.
1, 2, 3, she stopped. 4, 5. There it was, the suggestion of a 6th where there should have been only the suggestion of trees. Not a face. The geometry of a body that had remembered a shape. 6, she said, and felt foolish and relieved to have finished the sentence. "Good," Linnea said. "It means your house is telling the truth in the way a stubborn person tells the truth, half in order and half by accident. Don't open the box. Don't put salt on your thresholds. Fool's tricks. Take a jar of your grandmother's preserves, pear if you have it, and set it on the table with a spoon. Eat a spoonful. Leave a spoonful. Say, 'Thank you for letting us count ourselves and no more.' Do this before dusk sharpens itself. Do not let night start hungry." "We're not," Matt began, then faltered on the verb that would have made what they weren't into something they could claim. "We don't know how to do that." "You know how to feed a thing you share a house with," Linnea said. "You were raised well. When you've done it, call me back. I'll come out tomorrow with a ledger and some names you'll recognize, and some you'll learn to." The line clicked the way phones used to, with the sound of decision rather than mere interruption. "Pear," Isabel said. "Pear," Matt agreed, and went to the cellar door and put his ear to it for 1 heartbeat. Whatever he heard or didn't hear, he didn't report. They found the jar on the shelf in the pantry behind the applesauce and the pickled beans with their suspended ghosts of dill. The label was their grandmother's blocky hand, pears, syrup, light, and the year. The lid sighed when Isabel broke the seal. The scent came up, sugar and fruit and a little metal. She fetched 2 spoons and set the jar on the table where the rings had dried. Together, they ate a spoonful, the syrup sitting on their tongues like a story that wasn't theirs but had been told in their house so many times it might as well be. Then Isabel took a 3rd spoon, dipped it, and laid it gently beside the jar, syrup gleaming like a small, deliberate offering. "Thank you for letting us count ourselves and no more," she said, and saying it felt less foolish than she'd feared because the sentences shape-fit the room. They stood a moment, listening to the mannered silence of afternoon. From under the floor, a sound like the settling of boards, like a house deciding it had been properly addressed. Not the knocking. Not yet. Outside, the orchard breathed. It wasn't a sound. It was the way the light lay against the trunks and then slid off, the way the mist lifted as if inhaled. The rain had begun again so gently it could have been imagined. Somewhere toward the middle rows, a single apple thumped to ground and rolled until a rut held it. Dusk came on like an argument someone was determined to keep civil. In the hallway, the bulb flickered once, shored up its courage, and steadied. In the parlor, the sixth almost face in the photograph either sharpened or Isabel's eyes did. In the kitchen, the spoon by the jar lost its gloss slowly as the syrup crept toward the spoon's edge and dropped in one thick tear onto the wood, leaving a fourth ring near the three old ones. They ate dinner standing because chairs would have made it feel like an occasion, and neither of them wanted to give the night vocabulary. Matt pretended to watch a game on his phone to keep the world in a narrow, manageable rectangle. Isabel rinsed plates already clean. The house made quiet noises it could justify. The first 3 knocks came just after the kitchen clock admitted to 7 o'clock and decided to keep going. Not from the cellar this time. From the wall behind the stove, low, as if delivered by something that had learned the shape of the house's bones and was trying for a different door. 3 beats. A pause. A 4th, lighter, like an afterthought. "Thank you for not opening anything," Isabel said to the room because someone had asked her to learn a new grammar and she was trying for a perfect grade. "Not today." The house, kind or merely distracted, let the sentence stand. The orchard, behind the glass, leaned in without pressing. The spoon on the table made no further tear. For the first time that day, Isabel felt the narrow band of space between fear and the small, workmanlike hope that lets a person braid a rug, prune a tree, make a list. "Tomorrow," Matt said, and it sounded like both threat and prayer. "We'll let the historian tell us which doors our family built and forgot to number." The night, as if grateful to be given shape, began. Somewhere in town the church bell counted 8 without skipping 4. In the house, the photographs held their poses. Under the floor, something counted 2, but for once it let the living do their sums in peace. They slept the way people do in a house that has agreed to defer its questions, fully, and on the surface of their dreams like leaves on water. Only once did Isabel wake to that change in weather that wasn't weather, the sense that the dark had turned its head. She lay still and listened and heard only the orchard breathing in the rain, the low, wary intake of a place that wasn't done with them and had waited a long time to say so. Chapter 3, The Historian at the Gate. The day began without ever really beginning. Light was a rumor passed from one window to the next, never fully committed to entering the house. Mist lay low across the orchard, so heavy it flattened the grass, so thick that the trees seemed to hover in their own private clouds. From the upstairs hallway window, Isabel could see only the nearest rows, crooked trunks emerging from the gray like shipwrecked timbers. Beyond that, the orchard was swallowed entirely, a wall of pale nothing that made the rest of the world feel erased. She padded to the kitchen in wool socks, the boards underfoot cool and faintly damp from the night's weather. Matthew was already there, standing by the table with a scrap of paper in his hand, the one Rick had given them the day before. The paper had gone soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded. "She's coming," he said without looking up. His voice was still rough with sleep, but there was an alertness in it, the kind that meant he'd been up long enough to have 2 thoughts about the same worry.
10 o'clock.
Didn't ask for directions. "She knows the place," Isabel said, pulling out a chair. "She said she remembers the place," he corrected, laying the paper flat on the table and smoothing it with his palm. "Not the same thing. I'm not sure I like the tense she used." They ate breakfast because skipping it would have felt like skipping a line in a prayer and daring the rest to make sense. The coffee was darker than usual, tasting faintly metallic, as if the kettle had been thinking too long about the box under the crawlspace. The toast was dry before they touched it. Every few minutes, one or both of them would glance toward the cellar door. It sat in its corner like a child told to sit still and pretend to be good. The arrival, at 9:58, the sound of tires on wet gravel reached them. It was slow, unhurried, almost courteous. They both went to the front window. An old red Volvo wagon pulled into the yard, the mist parting reluctantly around it. The headlights were off, but the glass still caught the pale light in a way that made the car look like it had brought a piece of another morning with it. The driver's door opened, and Linnea Hart stepped out. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose knot that looked like it had been done hours ago and held without fuss. Her navy wool coat was buttoned to the throat. A scarf patterned with small apples and faded leaves lay tucked neatly under the collar. The boots on her feet were scuffed in a way that said they'd been places worth walking to. She carried a weathered canvas satchel in one hand, a closed black umbrella in the other, though the rain had thinned to a mist so fine it barely beaded on her coat. Matthew opened the door before she could knock. "Mr. Crowe," she said, her voice low and even, with a timbre that made you think of reading aloud by lamplight. Her eyes flicked to Isabel. "And you must be the one who counted the extra face in the wedding photograph." "That's me," Isabel said. It came out like a question, though Linnea didn't treat it like one. Linnea stepped inside without hesitation. Her boots made almost no sound, but the house responded to her entry, a faint settling somewhere upstairs, a creak in the wall as though weight had shifted inside it. From the kitchen drawer came the faintest rattle, as if the spoons had adjusted themselves. Taking the measure, she set her satchel on the kitchen table and unfastened the worn buckles. Inside were things that looked like they belonged both in an archive and in the bottom drawer of a workbench, a narrow leather-bound ledger with its spine worn to threads, a small brass keyring with no modern keys, each tooth cut for a lock you'd need to find by memory, a folded cloth pouch that clinked when she set it down, and a bundle of thin sticks tied with red thread. "This is not," she said, glancing from Isabel to Matthew, "a house that tolerates being ignored. And it's not one that rewards being bullied. We'll start by letting it speak. Then we'll decide what it's trying to say." She began a slow walk around the kitchen's perimeter. Her fingertips hovered just above the surfaces. The chair backs, the edge of the counter, the frame of the cellar door. Never quite touching, but close enough that Isabel swore she could feel a faint current pass between them. When Linnea reached the sink, she stopped and looked out the window. "You see them differently from here," she said. "The orchard?" Matthew asked. "Yes. From here, it doesn't look like rows. It looks like aisles." She tapped her nail against the glass, and the sound carried oddly far. Outside, one of the nearest branches swayed once, and then went still again. Aisles are for walking through, and aisles lead somewhere. The parlor test. She led them into the parlor, moving like someone who knew the house's layout but hadn't been here in years. The air in the room was cooler, edged with that particular stillness found in places where photographs outnumber living faces. Linnea went straight to the wedding photograph. 6, she said, not counting out loud, just stating it as if confirming an address. "You knew before you walked in," Isabel said. "I knew the story," Linnea replied. "Faces change over time. Sometimes they add themselves. Sometimes they fade. This one hasn't changed, which means it's bound to something steadier than weather or memory." Matthew frowned. Bound how? When a family keeps something closed, whether it's a box, a room, or a memory, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And sometimes it borrows space in what's still open. A photograph, a window, a voice on the telephone, the crawl space. In the cellar, she stopped halfway down the stairs and inhaled deeply. Damp. Metal. Bruised green, she said quietly, like she was reading a line from her ledger. She approached the low door without opening it. Instead, she set her palm flat against the wood. The reaction was immediate. A single, loud knock from within the crawl space. Not 3.
Just one.
A statement, not an invitation. It knows I'm here, she said, withdrawing her hand. What is it? Isabel asked. Something your great-grandfather thought he'd sealed away, Linnea said. It doesn't belong to him, or to you, but it decided to stay. The orchard walk. After lunch, thick slices of bread, cheese, and the last of the apples that hadn't rotted in storage. Linnea asked to see the orchard. The drizzle had thinned, but the air was still heavy enough to turn every surface slick. She walked without hesitation between the rows, but Isabel noticed she never stepped directly on the narrow, beaten paths. Instead, she walked a fraction to the left or right, her boots pressing into softer earth. Your family planted in rows, she said, but it grew in patterns. The ground here isn't just soil. It remembers where it's been disturbed. 3 rows in, she stopped. If you start here at dawn, no matter which direction you walk, you'll return to this tree. Not the edge of the orchard, not the house. This tree. The bark was dark with moisture. Near its base was a smooth oval where something had once been nailed and later removed. Isabel thought of the nail in the puddle by the first tree, the way water had collected around it as if drawn. In the 5th row, Linnea bent and picked up 3 apple stems lying parallel in the mud. She held them for a long moment, then placed them back exactly as they had been. Evening meal. They invited her to stay for supper. Stew, bread, and a jar of their grandmother's pears and syrup. The kitchen felt calmer with her in it. The constant little ticks and groans the house had made for weeks seemed to pause, as though the structure were listening politely. Linnea sat at the table as though she had been doing it for years. She ate slowly, chewing as if she were tasting more than food. After the plates were cleared, she took the pear jar, scooped 1 spoonful for herself, and set another spoon beside the jar. Thank you for letting us count ourselves and no more, she said evenly. From under the floorboards came a faint creak, not a knock, but the sound of something settling into a chair. When she left just after dark, the mist swallowed her taillights before they reached the road. The house seemed different. Not lighter, exactly, just quieter, as though it had been given something to think about. That night, for the first time since the knocking began, Isabel and Matt slept without hearing it. Chapter 4. The house remembers out loud. The silence was the first thing Isabel noticed when she woke. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence that came with a light frost or an early morning snow, the kind that seemed to have weight and warmth. This was thinner, stretched tight, like the pause between a question and the answer you don't want to hear. She lay still under the quilt, her ears straining for the now familiar 3-count rhythm from under the floorboards. Nothing.
No nada. No crear.
Not even the small settling noises the house made to remind them it was alive. The absence was so complete that it made her uneasy. She got out of bed slowly, as if a sudden movement might remind the house to start again. Morning in a changed house. Matthew was already in the kitchen, his elbows on the table, staring into a mug of coffee as though waiting for it to reveal a plan. Quiet night, he said without looking up. Too quiet, Isabel answered, pouring herself a cup. The coffee smelled faintly different, stronger, more bitter, though she'd used the same beans and the same pot as always. It was a small change, but it made her uneasy. You think it's because Linnea was here? He asked. I think it's because something decided to listen instead of speak, Isabel said. Matthew gave a short laugh that wasn't amusement. Listening is worse.
She didn't argue.
They drank their coffee with the kind of silence you use when you're trying to keep from drawing attention to yourselves, even though you don't know who or what you're avoiding. The first sign. It was Matthew who found it first. He'd gone to check the cellar door, more out of habit than anything else. The latch was still in place, the hasp still locked. But when he ran his hand over the wood, his fingers came away sticky. Come look at this, he called. Isabel came down the hall and saw what he meant. The surface of the door glistened faintly in the dim light, just in a patch about the size of a hand. She touched it and immediately pulled her fingers back. The residue was thick and sweet-smelling, like syrup or honey, but darker. That wasn't there last night, she said. No, Matthew agreed. And it's not leaking from anywhere. It's on the door, like it was put there. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to say it. Linnea had left them with a jar of pears, a spoonful taken, a spoonful offered. And now, something under the house had decided to return the favor. The kitchen rearranges. By mid-morning, they began to notice other changes. The pie on the counter, untouched for days, now had a perfect wedge missing, the knife laid neatly beside it. The silverware drawer had been organized into rigid, unnatural order. Spoons nested perfectly by size, forks lined like soldiers. A mug that had been chipped at the rim since Isabel was 12 now sat with the chip turned in, hidden from sight. "It's like someone tidied up," Matthew said slowly. "No," Isabel said, moving the mug back to its old position. "It's like someone wants us to think they're tidying up." Outside, the orchard was still heavy with mist. The light was dull and flat, the kind that made it impossible to tell the time without a clock. The call. The phone rang just before noon. The landline again. Matthew and Isabel looked at each other. "You answer," he said. Isabel picked it up. "Crowe Place." This time, the voice wasn't Linnea's or the mystery woman's. It was a man, old, with the kind of rural accent that made every vowel sound older than the speaker. "You got a tree marked red," he said. "What?" Isabel asked. "Third row in. Second tree on the left. Marked red. You know why it's marked." Isabel swallowed. "Why?" "'Cause it's the one they buried under," the man said, and then hung up. The orchard again. They went outside without discussing it. The mist clung to their hair and clothes, soaking them through in minutes. The red-twined tree stood where it always had, its bark slick and dark. Beneath it, the earth was soft, as if it had been turned recently. A shallow depression had formed in the ground, no bigger than a barrel lid. Matthew crouched and pressed his hand into the soil. "It's warm," he said quietly. "The ground's warm." Isabel stepped back, suddenly aware of how close the other trees seemed. The rows that had always looked straight from the house now seemed to curve ever so slightly inward, drawing them toward the marked tree. Nightfall. By late afternoon, the mist thickened again, and the orchard seemed to recede until only the first 2 rows were visible. The rest was a wall of pale nothing. Inside, the house had taken on a different kind of quiet, not the tense, waiting silence of the morning, but something more deliberate. Every so often Isabel thought she heard a faint hum, like bees in the walls, but when she pressed her ear to the plaster, there was nothing. They ate dinner without speaking much. Afterward, Isabel washed the dishes and left them to dry in the rack. When she turned back to the table, the pear jar was there, open, with the spoon still resting on its lip. She hadn't brought it out. Neither had Matthew. The air in the kitchen had a different weight to it now, a sweet stickiness woven into the steam from the sink, the ghost heat from the stove, the damp breath the house exhaled whenever weather pressed its thumb against the roof. Isabel stood very still and watched the open jar, the spoon glimmering with a meniscus of syrup that looked thick as thought. The spoon trembled once, not with any visible force, just a small acceptance of gravity's invitation, and a drop side off, and struck the table. It joined the faint halos from earlier days, darkening to a ring that would dry and announce itself later, when memory grew fond of proof. "Don't touch it," Matthew said softly, though she hadn't moved. His eyes were not on the jar but on the doorway to the hall, where the runner lay just slightly skewed, as if someone with courteous feet had passed and remembered at the last second not to leave boot prints. They did what you do when a day proposes a game you didn't agree to play. They made busy shapes with their hours. Matthew went out to the shed and returned with twine and stakes to mark where he would dig a shallow trench to pull rainwater away from the foundation. Isabel picked up every stray paper and bill, smoothing them flat and placing them in rational stacks that might persuade reality to behave. Neither of them said the orchard had changed its posture. You learned, in Briar Hollow, not to reward a landscape for dramatics. By mid-afternoon the light had gone to pewter again. The mist had thickened in the pasture, so the fence posts rose from it like the ribs of a long animal sunk in shallow water. When she could bear it no more, Isabel took down the jar of rice from the pantry, the one their grandmother had kept not for eating but for keeping company. She felt the weight of it in her hands, that low music of grain against glass. She stood at the back door and hesitated with the lid. Her grandmother's voice arrived as voices do when you stand where they once stood. Don't toss, love, strew. Tossing is for the careless, strewing is for the courteous. She strewed, a small fan of rice across the threshold, each grain landing with the tiny pragmatism of things that ask little and do their job. For a moment, nothing claimed the gesture. Then the house gave a small sound. Not knock, not creak, not draft. A sound like two pieces of paper finding one another in a stack. She breathed out and felt, absurdly, thanked. Superstition, Matthew murmured, but his voice lacked the muscle of dismissal. He fetched the broom and propped it by the door. Bristles up, another inherited habit with no diagram behind it, just a certainty that some mouths preferred to be fed sugar, some preferred to be kept from sweeping. They ate early, though it was the kind of early the day made you earn by dilating its hours until your stomach learned distrust. Stew again, the broth thickened by time, bread warmed in the oven until the crust turned loud. Isabel lit the small hurricane lamp their grandmother had kept on the table for power cuts and grief. The flame's small circle of gold turned the room into a polite story where nothing terrible happened because the light would be ashamed to witness it. In the middle of a spoonful, the landline rang. Not the tentative chirp of a robocall, not the oblivious cheer of a wrong number. 3 even peals, a pause, then 3 again, the cadence of a person who knew you were home and was willing to wait for you to admit it. Matthew reached first. Crowe Place. A woman's voice. Old without being fragile, as if aged oak could speak. Is it quiet? It was, he said. Now you've rung. A dry chuckle. Better a voice than a fist. Don't go counting the quiet as luck. Quiet is when it chooses a better door. Who is this? Isabel asked, close enough to hear the faint rasp of breath on the other end, the brittle cotton sound of distance inside telephones. Someone who remembers your grandmother's rules and your great-grandfather's sins, the woman said simply. Red twine was not for pruning. Isabel's mouth went dry. Who buried what under the red? Not a who, the woman said gently. A how. And a how long. Don't dig. Not with metal, not with hands. If the ground offers you something, you may take it. If it keeps its jaw shut, you wait until it speaks. Tonight is a jaw night. A soft intake of air, as if she'd smelled the pears from wherever she was. You left a spoonful. That was right. When it drops the spoon, you listen to the room it lands in. The line clicked off with the old-fashioned manners of decision. Isabel stood looking at the receiver in her hand, feeling the small electric ache in her palm that used to mean you'd held a conversation and now meant nothing at all. Linnea? Matthew asked. I don't think so, Isabel said, but kin to her kind of knowing. Dusk did that rural trick of giving you a longer runway than city dark. Thin blue-gray light stretched to the limits of its thinness, and then 1, 2, 3 sudden steps into night. The orchard receded incrementally until even the first row lost its detail and became a black lace, a filigree of absence. Inside, the hurricane lamp declared its small sovereignty. The overhead bulb, resentful of competition, flickered once and steadied. Isabel carried the rice jar back to the pantry and paused. On the shelf above, pushed back as if shy about being seen, sat a ledger she had never noticed, cloth-bound, corners blunted by decades of hands. No dust lay on it. Dust, in this house, went where it was told. She lifted it down. A smell came up, paper, soot, the faint sweetness of old glue. The front flyleaf held a name in an upright, confident hand. Elias Crowe, with the date beneath in a script that looked like it disliked being told what year it was. Under that, another, smaller hand had added, in pencil, keeps and tithes. Matt, she said. They opened it at the table as if it might leak. Inside, columns, dates, weights, names not of people but of things. Nails, counted and then counted again. Buttons, described not by color, but by what they'd once fastened. From Ruth's Sunday black, off the infant's cloak, one bone, one pearl. In the margin, in the same confident hand, a word Isabel could imagine being spoken in a man's voice that didn't apologize much. Paid. What did he pay, and to whom? Matthew asked. They turned the page and found what might have been a map if a map had been drawn by someone who believed in circles more than lines. The orchard rendered not as rows, but as a round with spokes, the red twine tree at the center, little marks at the edges like teeth. Numbers beside the teeth. 3, 3, 3, 4 a note. Walkers prefer odd, counters prefer even. Bargain when both arrive. I hate this, Matthew said, but his finger had already begun to trace the circles. I hate it, and I understand the part of him that wanted to make ledger of it. What kind of man weighs apples and names and nails the same way?
Isabel whispered.
The kind who thinks counting is how you keep a thing from stepping into your bed, he said. Upstairs, the attic spoke. Not in knocks. They were learning its voices now. This was the sound of a single football placed with care on boards that took a footstep like information. Isabel lifted her head, the way a dog does when it hears its name in the next room. Matthew breathed, "Stay," which was never a word that worked on her, and she stood anyway. The staircase to the attic turned once and twice, narrow enough that your shoulder guarded the wall for you. The door at the top, lavatory green in the way of old bad decisions, stood closed. The brass knob looked the kind of cold metal gets when it has not been touched for years, and would prefer to keep it that way. She placed her ear against the wood, because that is what people do even when they know it is silly and were taught, as children, that doors only speak to hands. Nothing. Only her own breath turned hollow against the panel. She stepped back and looked down the hall. The lamplight from the landing gave the air a thickness, a honeyed quality that made movement feel slow, as if she'd walked underwater into a long memory. Their grandmother had kept trunks up here. Every summer as kids they'd raided them for quilts to build forts that never held. Isabel thought of quilt forts now, of the uselessness of making walls from comfort. Not today, she told the door gently. The door made no sound, but the house did, a little shift in the wall beside her, two boards rubbing past each other with the affection of old dancers. She descended and found Matthew where she had left him, bent over the ledger like a man who suspects his blood runs through the ink. He tapped a finger against a line near the back. Here, he said. It read, in a different hand than Elias's, tighter, pinched, a person who had learned to write while someone frowned at them. Payment accepted. Orchard holds. House counts its own. No name. Only a small drawn mark beside it. A symbol Isabel almost recognized from childhood. 3 circles in a neat row and a 4th lower to the right, like a child's idea of Orion's belt. A soft thought came from the living room. They both turned, and the feeling wasn't fear exactly. It was more like hearing a glass placed carefully on a coaster in a house you believed you were alone in. They rose together and walked to the parlor. On the table under the wedding photograph, 3 small wet circles had appeared, spaced with the fussiness of a good schoolteacher. The 4th sat a little apart, oblique as a foot turned toward leaving. No vessel stood above them. The wood itself bore the damp. Where is it coming from? Matthew asked in the tone of a man who would accept, if told in plain words, that the answer was under or between or then and not now. Isabel put her palm just above one ring, not touching, because she had learned not to touch without invitation. Warmth rose, not heat. The kind of warmth a person's breath has when it hits your wrist as they whisper into their hand to tell you a secret. I think, she said slowly, it's not coming from anywhere. I think it's arriving. There are nights when Briar Hollow performs ordinary darkness, the kind that makes you think of coyotes and far-off trains, and the respect owed to black ice. There are other nights when it seems like the dark is an old ledger being balanced by someone you can't see. This was the second kind. The wind had gone on somewhere else to fight with trees unconnected to their family. The rain had decided numbers were boring tonight. The orchard held its breath so completely the earth's pores must have closed. The world had made a desk of itself and was writing. They sat back at the table, because sitting was a stance their bodies recognized as safe. Isabel turned the ledger pages until the pencil record bled into ink again, then into charcoal, then back into nothing, the end of the book where blankness asks you to imagine what men would have written if they had remembered how. She left it open to a page with a list headed tithes not paid and recognized. In a stab of quiet shame, 3 items that were not objects but verbs. Asking, naming, opening. Linnea will have a field day, Matthew murmured. Linnea will have a ledger of her own, Isabel said, and then they both listened because something had shifted its attention to the back door. The rice. It moved. Not as a scatter, not blown by a draft. 3 grains slid an inch inward across the threshold and stopped. A pause. A silence that contained a question. Then a 4th grain moved, not in line with the 3, but angled toward the kitchen, as if it had decided, with a small and ancient politeness, to be its own person. She could have brushed them back with her toe, restored some petty border. Instead, she said, "Thank you," because the unknown woman's voice had asked her to listen when the spoon fell, and this felt close enough to a falling. The house gave that paper sound again, a sigh of arrangement. "Come away," Matthew said, not because he felt threatened, but because he feared she might be too brave for a minute that asked for careful cowardice. They returned to their chairs and pretended to be interested in receipts and twine. Toward midnight, the hum she'd been half-imagining made itself real enough that she could follow it to the northeast wall. She laid her ear to the plaster. Not bees. Not power lines. A vibration more like a cat purr sustained in the bones of a much larger animal. The hum rose in a slow arc, held, then fell. In the pause, a knock from the crawl space would have been expected. It did not arrive. Instead, a single, dry tap sounded from the ceiling, exactly over the kitchen table. They looked up. The ceiling showed nothing but paint. A drop of syrup clung to the underside of the spoon, heavy with decision. Then fell. Not onto wood this time, but into the open mouth of the jar, a soft plop like a coin paid correctly into a till. The phone rang as if it had been waiting for that small currency to change hands. Isabel lifted it. Crowe Place. Good, Linnea said, crisp with approval, as though she'd been watching a child tie a particular knot properly for the first time. You left the spoon and didn't scold it when it learned to serve itself. Something moved the rice, Isabel said. 3 and then a 4th. Is that good? It means you're having a conversation, Linnea said. It means it accepted the portion and offered counting as its reply. Tomorrow I'll come with a map your great-grandfather never showed anyone and a list your grandmother could never bring herself to read out loud. Do not dig the red twine tree. Do not open the box. Do not stand with your back to the attic door after midnight. Why the attic? Matthew asked, his glance slipping, despite himself, toward the stair that turned out of sight. Because the house is remembering there, Linnea said. And the attic is where memory goes to keep from getting dusted. A pause. If it knocks tonight, it will not be the crawl space. It will be the room with your map of the orchard. When it does, answer it by moving a chair. How? Isabel asked. Is that an answer? Chairs are the way a house counts people, Linnea said. You'll see. She hung up. The house did not. It kept talking in its hums and complicated silences, in the way the lamp flame leaned toward the door like a dog nosing a draft. They waited, listening not for what they had learned to expect, but for the strange that had made a reservation. It arrived in the sitting room, not loud. 3 taps against the baseboard beneath the window where the world had once been all April Saturdays and Sunday papers and their grandmother's laugh. Isabel stood and went in with her hand around the back of a chair. The chair was old oak, stern as a high school principal. She lifted it 2 inches and set it down 1 foot to the left, every muscle saying, "This is ridiculous," and every unfoolish part of her saying, "This is fluent." The second she set it down, something in the wall shifted from attention to rest. The hum lowered by a degree, settling into the kind of sound a place makes when it has been answered in its own syntax. "You see?" Matthew asked behind her, not derisive now, simply curious to be convinced by the fact that his own eyes hadn't had the nerve to invent. She didn't answer because answering would have asked for a rulebook, and this was a game you played by instinct and borrowed manners. Instead, she walked to the parlor and looked up at the wedding photograph. The sixth and knot face in the window had sharpened a fraction, as if pleased to have one appoint in an argument no one alive had been allowed to participate in. Sometime near 1 a.m, a sound rose from the yard. Not digging, exactly, but the soft then steady heave of ground adjusting itself. They stood at the back door with the lamp held low. Mist made the yard a bowl of milk. Beyond the first row, the orchard became suggestion. Beneath the red twine, the earth had rounded a little more, swelling like something underneath had taken a breath. "Don't," Matthew said before she took the step she had already decided to take. She stopped. The swell subsided slightly, as if it approved of being obeyed. They returned inside. The ledger lay open to Elias's circles. It looked, suddenly, like less of a comfort and more of a confession. Isabel laid her palm on the page. The paper was cool. She understood why men like him had written. Numbers were ropes, and they had thrown them around the night to see what they could pull in. Here it had tied a portion of darkness to a family and called that success. "Tomorrow," she said, because saying tomorrow was a way to get through the last inch of the day without panic. "Tomorrow," Matthew agreed, and the word sat on the table between them like an apple you leave on a sill for company. They slept like people do in houses that have agreed not to ask one more question after midnight. When Isabel woke just before dawn, the gray under the curtains had that grainy texture that means a day has made up its mind to be the kind you cannot tidy. She went to the kitchen and found the spoon where it had been left, the jar lidded and wiped clean with a neatness neither of them possessed at such hours. On the table lay 3 pear seeds set in a row and a fourth of fingers width apart, all pointing toward the door. At the threshold, the rice had arranged itself into a slight curve, neither invitation nor warning. Exactly, a shape like a smile if a smile were solemn. She opened the door to the morning. The orchard breathed out a long, low draft that smelled of wet bark and the iron in creek water. Somewhere in the middle rose a single apple let go, struck earth, and rolled until a rut received it. The sound traveled along the ground like a personal delivery. Behind her, Matthew said from the staircase, "Linnea's coming early. She texted me. She said, the house had a good night. Let's not waste its mood." "Does it have moods?" Isabel asked, and then, because she knew the answer without needing to be told, "Of course it does." They ate toast buttered to corners that morning because exactness felt like participation. When the Volvo turned into the yard, the mist drew back obligingly, a curtain reading the stage directions. Linnea stepped out with her satchel and, this time, a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. She looked at Isabel's face, at Matthew's, and then passed them into the rooms. "Good," she said simply, like a teacher who'd smelled a correct answer. She placed the parcel on the table and began to loosen its string. "We'll take the long way round the truth today," she said without looking up. "It's the only road that lasts. We'll start with a story and a map. Then we'll discuss how to count without letting it count you back." The string came free. The paper fell away. Under it lay a map of the orchard drawn in a careful hand that wasn't Elias's, with notations in their grandmother's blunt script. Arrows, dates, small additions in the margins that read like prayers rewritten as instructions. In one corner, in a square cut at a diagonal to the rest, a list of names wore the tired dignity of people who did not expect to be spoken aloud in any pleasant room. Isabel felt the room lean toward their table, the walls, the boards, even the cupboards. A house listening, a house remembering out loud. And outside, the orchard gathered itself, and the day thinned its gray to a usable light, and the line between the box beneath them and the tree with its patient, swollen earth drew itself not on paper but through their bodies, as if they were the ledger now, and the task was to be written in without becoming the thing that had to be paid. She drew a breath, as one draws a boundary on a map. "Show us," she said. "All of it. But not the door that can't be closed again." Linnea nodded, her eyes warming at the exactness of the plea. "Then we begin," she said, "and the house. polite as ever, particular as always, gave, somewhere under their feet, a single, consenting knock. Chapter 5. The Long Way Round. The string came free with that papery sigh of good craft, and Linnea folded the brown neatly, as if the paper itself were a document that deserved a place in someone's keeping, before setting it aside. The map beneath had the chill of objects that have sat a long time in dark drawers, a careful hand, squares and arcs, ink brown to tea, edges feathered by fingers that had not always been clean. In the margin, their grandmother's blunt notes marched like field orders, dates, arrows, an occasional scolding verb, don't, mind, strew, and once, a gentler if you can help it that, made Isabel's throat tighten with a homesick feeling that didn't attach to any place she could name. Look, Linnea said, tapping a fingernail on a circle drawn over the center rose. Your great-grandfather called this the crown. Your grandmother called it the mouth. Both are true, depending on who's asking. Matthew leaned in. The paper smelled faintly of old apples and the irony of iron. And this. He traced the small symbols like teeth around the edge of the orchard. These are what? Fence posts. Stops, Linnea said. Places you can stop without losing count. You'd be surprised how often those aren't the same thing as your fence posts. We have fence posts, Matthew said, but without heat. He wasn't arguing so much as reminding the paper that it was a stranger in a room full of furniture that had survived better guests. Isabel's finger hovered above a set of tidy hash marks along one margin. The numbers beside them read 3, 3, 3, 4, repeated down the page like an incantation someone had taught a reluctant child. How do you know when it's the fourth? She asked, and not that you've just miscounted one. You feel the house breathe between the third and the fourth, Linnea said, so matter-of-factly that Isabel had the absurd urge to check the kitchen walls for ribs. And if you don't feel it, it wasn't meant for you. Either way, you don't pretend. They stood for a while, without moving. The day was the same pewter as the last one, but with a steadier hand. The mist had thinned to a gauze that moved when you looked at it, as if light itself had stopped to breathe. Somewhere outside, a truck passed on the road, and the sound thinned to a ghost noise by the time it reached the orchard, a respectful distant rumble that did not presume to interrupt. Show us, Matthew said, and there was a small humility in the request that Isabel recognized from seasons when men with strong backs learned to ask permission of weather. We'll walk, Linnea said simply. We'll carry the map, and we'll not pretend we aren't being watched. It is a courtesy to admit the truth. They put on their coats, the ones that were never quite dry this season, and stepped into the yard. The air had the clean mineral smell of creek water and the gummy sweetness of the pear jar's leftover syrup. Under it all, the orchard's darker breath rose, more root than fruit. The red-twined tree waited with the offended dignity of a marked thing. Under its drip line, the soil held the memory-swollen dome it had swelled to in the night, then subsided, as if embarrassed at having revealed appetite. Not today, Linnea said to the earth with no performative flourish, the way a woman tells a dog that loves her not to leap. The soil held still. They began at the gate. Isabel carried the map because Matthew's hands looked lately like hands built to hold weight, not paper, and the weight that paper had acquired in this house felt like a supplication you shouldn't ask of a man who spent his mornings measuring trenches and his afternoons rearranging chairs to answer baseboard taps. Linnea walked a shoulder's width off the path, watching their feet and the trees and the place where feet and trees failed to agree. The rows look straight from the porch, Isabel said. And they are if you stand in the right place and decide to be convinced. Out here, she added, and felt foolish, they lean. Everything leans in a place that remembers storms, Linnea said. If your eyes want straight lines, you'll need to build them yourself. But don't scold the trees for preferring a truer geometry. They kept to the middle run. 2 rows in, the ground took a degree of spring that Isabel had not felt yesterday. 3 in, she heard a sound that might have been her own breath in her hood, and might have been the orchard's, a slow, fabric-soft hiss like wet bark adjusting its shirt. 4 in, Linnea stopped without warning and put a hand to the nearest trunk. We will not turn right, she said. We always turn right at the wash table, Matthew said. It's how you make the circle back. Yes, Linnea said with a ghost of a smile. And today the circle would be longer than you have daylight for. Left. They turned left. The row they entered was the sort that becomes a memory's hallway. The same shape repeating and repeating until your mind takes a small step sideways to avoid boredom and you miss the door you meant to take. Isabel looked down and saw 3 apple stems lying parallel in the track, as neatly aligned as pins. She stepped over them because she was tired of learning rules the hard way. See how the light doesn't change, Linnea said, even when you pass through shadow. That's how you know you're being walked, not walking. Walked by what? Matthew asked, more interested than defensive. By your own history, she said. It likes to practice with people it already knows. They came at last to a fork Isabel didn't remember being there. The map in her hands did not show it, which made something logical in her stomach go cold. Their grandmother had been too thorough to leave out a branch. On the ground between the 2 paths, someone had drawn a shallow curve with a stick and pressed 3 finger marks into the wet soil along it, then a 4th a little separate, like a child learning punctuation. Kids, Matthew said automatically, but the word didn't finish itself in his mouth. You could always tell when a town's children had been somewhere because the place still wore their laughter. The orchard, just now, wore no laughter at all. They took the left-hand fork because the right-hand one smelled faintly of iron, and Isabel had learned from kitchens and cut fingers to respect the times iron introduced itself without being asked. The mist thinned under the trees for 3 rows, and for 3 rows after that it deepened, and in those deep patches the sound of the creek came strangely closer, a near running in your ear as if water had decided to take a shortcut through memory on its way to the river. When they emerged into a brighter pocket, Linnea stopped and touched Isabel's elbow. Here, she said, this is a stop. She crouched and brushed aside a tuft of flattened grass. Beneath it lay a coin of beaten metal nailed flush with the ground. No head, no tail, just a circle dulled by weather. A second nail glinted inside it, off-center by a fraction, as if the man who'd hammered it had been distracted mid-strike. Elias, Isabel said, surprising herself with the intimacy. Linnea nodded. He measured this way, she said, not with paces, with places that agreed to hold still for a decade. This one has wobbled in its thinking, but it has not moved. From there, the orchard's arrangement of wrongness grew subtler. An apple fell somewhere behind them and rolled as if to catch up, then decided against it. The latter 3 rows over seemed nearer, and then not, the way familiar things do when you look up too fast from reading. A blackbird landed ahead of them on a branch and cocked its head to show them an eye as slick and unhelpful as a bead. When it lifted, no wing beat sounded. Air's too wet to record noise properly, Matthew said, and even Isabel, who had not been offered that kind of science in school, nodded because it was easier to agree than to admit that the silence had arrived deliberately. By late afternoon, the map had rearranged itself from abstraction into a route they could hold in their bodies. Isabel no longer looked at the lines to know where to put her feet. The trees had lent her their muscle memory. She recognized, somewhere below knowing, the turn that would have delivered them back to the red twine tree. She bypassed it with the small guilty pleasure of ignoring a chore. Linnea approved without praise. There are hours, she said, when obedience will only teach you the wrong lesson more quickly. They reached the top fence just as the light made its daily decision to become something you could no longer mistake for morning. The creek on the far side made its honest S. The pasture smelled of damp straw and that clean, melancholy sweetness places exhale when summer is no longer possible. Isabel let the map down and rolled her shoulders. The paper left a faint dust on her hands that made her palms look older. Questions, Linnea said, and the word itself was a courtesy, like loosening your collar in someone else's prayer. Who called our house last night and told us not to dig? Isabel asked. A woman who used to sit in your grandmother's kitchen and trade instructions, Linnea said. Her name won't help you. She likes to be useful without being thanked. Do you know what's in the box? Matthew said. I know what it isn't, Linnea said. It isn't a person. It isn't a pet. It isn't treasure in any way that satisfies Banks. She looked at them for a long, measuring moment that didn't feel unkind. And it isn't empty, which is the mercy and the trouble. They ate supper early because country light makes liars of clocks. Stew again, the sort of repetition that keeps days from wobbling off their axles. Linnea refused a second, helping with a small satisfied look Isabel thought of as an older woman's belt notch, one you keep even after the body stops caring. Then stood and rinsed her bowl with the mannerly thoroughness of a person raised in houses where water came grudgingly and you didn't make it do double work. When she set the bowl on the rack, a soft tapping came from the hallway, the skitter of a bead across a hardwood floor. They all turned their heads, and then, because that was too much like flinching, all three of them pretended to be interested in the towel. "No attic tonight," Linnea said conversationally.
No sé ya.
"If it asks, we'll answer in chairs and spoons." "Chairs and spoons," Matthew repeated, as if memorizing an address in a city where the streets had moved overnight. After she left, headlights swallowed whole at the end of the drive. The house adopted a freshly scrubbed quiet that managed to be both suspicious and grateful. Isabel put on the kettle because hot water is a treaty you offer to evenings with opinions. While it heated, a small draft tried the kitchen door and changed its mind. She strewed rice again, without making a ceremony of it. 3 grains slid inward in unison this time, as if pleased to be expected. The 4th paused and then made a shorter journey, as if demonstrating temperance. They took their mugs to the parlor, where the wedding photograph did its work of holding people upright for longer than any body should be expected to stand. The 6th and non-face in the window held its suggestion without becoming a demand. Matthew, without looking at her, moved the oak chair beneath it a hand's width to the right. The sound the chair made, wood against old braided rug, was ordinary enough to be a relief. In the baseboard, something changed the way a room changes when someone you love decides not to say the ugly thing they were about to say. The house's hum fell half a note. "Doors and chairs," Isabel said. "Maps and rice." I never once envied grandmother her rules when I was a child. "We didn't have to," Matthew said. She took the chores that didn't show. The phone did not ring. The spoon did not drop. The attic did not add a footstep to the ledger. And yet the evening flexed around them, as if some muscle in the house were practicing a movement it intended to use later. At 8:17, Isabel looked because she didn't trust her sense of time anymore. She heard the sound of water where there should have been none. Not the sink, not the kettle. A light, provisional running, like creek talk heard through a wall. It lasted exactly as long as it took to think, "What is that?" and then stopped, the way a child stops humming when you look up from your book. "Pipes," Matthew offered, because houses deserve the chance to be innocent. "Sure," Isabel said, and placed the pear jar in the center of the table with the spoon laid beside it, a silver promise neither of them had to make. They didn't say a thank you aloud this time. The room had learned the sentence. It came back in a new grammar. 3 apple seeds on the table, arranged not in their now familiar row but in a small triangle with the 4th off to one side, as if drawing a map of a thing that didn't want to be a map yet. Isabel had the almost irreverent urge to get a ruler, to measure the distances, to put numbers to a geometry that still smelled of fruit. She didn't. She took the seeds and put them in her pocket, like a gullible pilgrim. "Can we call this wrong and still be normal people?" Matthew asked, half smiling. It was the smile he wore when he had carried too many sacks from the truck by himself and needed someone to tell him he'd done enough. "We can call it wrong and then decide whether to behave," Isabel said. "It's what normal people do, every day." At 9:45, the house offered them a gift. A gust that moved through all the rooms at once, quick and cool, smelling strongly of the creek and faintly of smoke. It lifted the hair on Isabel's arms and then was gone. When she went to the back door, the mist had thinned enough that the first row of trees had regained their bark, their scars, their proper weight. Under the red-twined tree the ground lay flat, too flat, like a person standing too still in a crowd. "You see," Matthew said, beside her. "Nothing happened. We've spent a day learning to be sensible about nonsense." He didn't sound disappointed. He sounded as if someone had returned to him a tool he'd once known how to use, and He was curious to see if the grip still fit his hand. They went to bed with their shoes parallel by the door, an old woman's rule neither of them had teased when she was alive and could have scolded them. Isabel lay listening to the thin country noises the house allowed back into itself now that night had earned them. The click in the hall where the runner's edge bent under drafts, the tick of a baseboard nail conceding heat, the whisper of her own throat reminding her not to name what had not yet finished naming itself. She drifted and woke and drifted again, and in one of those half places, a series of quiet, plausible events happened in an order that felt like instruction. The window in the parlor admitted a ribbon of colder air that smelled of lavender and damp iron. A soft weight like a cat settled briefly on the kitchen chair and then stepped down with the self-respect of creatures that do not apologize for existing. Somewhere, perhaps in the cellar, perhaps in the wall behind the stove, a single nail adjusted itself and decided against squealing.
No knacks, no spectacle.
Only the accumulation of small correctnesses that make a wrongness undeniable. At dawn, the house had replaced alarm with duty. In the kitchen, the spoon lay where they had left it, but the pear jar had migrated a hand's breadth toward the edge of the table, as if a courteous guest had made room for a late arrival. On the ledger, which neither of them remembered leaving open, a sprig lay, 3 leaves, pale and tender, veined like hands. Isabel lifted it and smelled nothing. No green, no rot, no fruit. It felt like paper cut to resemble a living thing. Linnea arrived before 9 with mud on one boot and a look on her face that Isabel had seen on weathered men when they came in from a field they had not been paid to plow. She set her satchel down with unusual care. "Good," she said softly, eyes going at once to the map and then to the jar and the spoon and the seeds in Isabel's open palm. "It was wrong all night," she added, and her approval was not cruel. "And no one will be able to say, so, who wasn't in this room." "What now?" Matthew asked, and it was not a demand for answers so much as an offer to be told what to do with his hands. "Now," Linnea said, "we write down what did not happen and decide how to behave anyway." She put a finger on the map's center circle. "We'll walk the crown in daylight and count without looking like counters. We'll make the attic polite by asking it a question it already knows how to answer. And we will not open the box, though it will spend the day trying to convince you there's a useful reason to do so." "We're not opening the box," Isabel said, and realized she had said it the way their grandmother had sometimes said grace, not as a request, but as a grateful refusal of what could go wrong. "Good," Linnea said again, and then, because houses are vain and like to be included in plans, the wall gave a small approving click exactly where the baseboard had sighed the night before. It was an ordinary morning after an ordinary wrong night. The stove grudged its heat, the kettle preened, the orchard showed them the same rows it had showed them yesterday, and a new path that had not existed last week. Nothing touched them that they could not explain to a neighbor without making the neighbor step back. Nothing spoke a word the ear could trap. And yet the chair stood a thumb nearer the door. The rice had arranged itself into a prudent curve. The ledger had a sprig pressed into it that did not belong to any season. They drank coffee that tasted, finally, of only coffee. When they stepped out into the yard, the damp had that cheerful bite that means a day has chosen usefulness. The red twine tree waited still. The ground at its feet mended to plainness, without having been fixed. And the long way, round stretched before them, honest in its wrongness, ready to be walked without being solved. "Come on," Linnea said, shouldering the map as if it were a tool. "Let's be sensible about it." They went 3 figures between aisles that were not rows, under branches that clicked against each other like cutlery being put away in the right drawers. Behind them, in the kitchen of the house that had learned to remember out loud, the spoon lay at rest, the jar kept its mouth shut, and the phone, impeccably polite, waited until no one was there to ring. Chapter 6, The House That Counts. The orchard looked different at noon, though different was one of those lazy words Isabel used when she couldn't quite name what she meant. Sunlight sat heavier on the grass, but didn't make the air any warmer. The rows seemed straighter now, but only if she kept her eyes forward and didn't count the lean of trunks in her periphery. Even the birds were disciplined in their noise. A short run of notes, silence. Another short run, silence again. Not quite pattern, not quite accident. Linnea walked ahead, the map tucked under her arm like a hymnal. She'd stopped referring to it aloud, though Isabel noticed her glance at it every time they passed a tree whose bark had split in a long, vertical wound. Linnea didn't touch those trees, but she always slowed. Matthew noticed it too. He had the alert stillness of a man who's learned to measure someone's walking pace for the story it tells. By the time they returned to the yard, the shadows had begun their slow, sure creep toward the house. Linnea didn't go to her truck this time. Instead, she stepped onto the porch and laid the map on the swing, as if setting down an instrument she'd been playing too long. "You've learned enough outside," she said. "Time to learn inside. The house keeps its own orchard." "What does that mean?" Matthew asked. "You'll see." She opened the door without knocking. Not rudeness, just the assurance of someone who believed doors were for weather, not people. Inside, the light shifted. Isabel couldn't explain it except to say it felt closer, like the air itself was leaning in. Linnea moved room to room without hurry, pointing to things that seemed perfectly ordinary until she said something about them. "This crack in the plaster? Leave it. If you patch it, the door across the hall will swell shut. This window latch? Don't force it. When it doesn't want to catch, it means something. Outside doesn't want to be looked at. This chair? Never sit in it when you're the only one home. If you do, you'll hear someone cross the room behind you and stand there, waiting to be answered." She didn't linger on any of it, just gave each instruction like a weather report, matter of fact, not up for debate. In the dining room, she stopped at the cabinet in the corner, the one Isabel had avoided looking at since they moved back. Inside were old glass tumblers, cloudy with age. Linnea opened the door and took one out, setting it on the table. "This is the listening glass," she said. "You put it against the wall if you want to hear what the house is thinking. Never do it more than once in a day." "Why?" Isabel asked. "Because the second time, it will start asking you questions." She put the glass back and closed the door with the care one gives a sleeping animal. They ended in the kitchen, where the box sat on the counter like it had been waiting for them all morning. No one had moved it since they'd found it under the crawlspace hatch, but Isabel swore it was angled differently now, the twine a little looser. Linnea didn't touch it. She just looked at it the way some people look at a fence before deciding whether to climb. "You've decided not to open it," she said. "We've decided," Matthew confirmed. "Good. Keep deciding. It will keep asking." That afternoon, rain came without warning. Not a storm, just a steady, polite soaking that erased the edges of the orchard. They stayed inside, the air filled with the hum of the refrigerator, the smell of coffee, the slow ticking of the wall clock. It should have been a comfortable day. It wasn't. Every so often, Isabel caught the faint scent of apples where there were none. Not fresh apples, but cider that had sat too long in the bottle. She didn't mention it until Matthew said, "Do you smell that?" At the same moment she thought it. Linnea looked up from the table, her expression unreadable. "Don't follow it," she said. "It doesn't lead anywhere you need to go." They obeyed. Mostly. It was after dark, with the rain still falling, that the first real thing happened. They were in the parlor, the box on the kitchen counter out of sight, but not out of mind, when a sound came from the back hallway, a slow, deliberate scraping, like wood being dragged across the floor. It lasted 3 seconds, then silence. They looked at each other, waiting for someone to stand up. No one did. "Pipes," Matthew said, but there was no conviction in it. "Pipes don't scrape," Isabel replied, and immediately wished she hadn't. A few minutes later, the smell returned, stronger now, and with it, something else. The faintest trace of smoke, not wood smoke, but paper. Isabel's mind jumped to the box. She pictured something inside it burning just slowly enough to leave a whisper of scent. Her palms went damp. Linnea stood, went into the kitchen, and returned carrying the box. She set it in the middle of the parlor table. "You don't have to answer it," she said, "but it's better to admit you heard." They sat in silence. The smell was stronger now, a mix of cider and charred paper, like the remnants of a letter burned in a fireplace. Matthew reached out, almost touched the twine, and stopped. What happens if? You'll be answering for longer than you meant to, Linnea cut in. The smell faded. The box stayed still. Later, when they finally went to bed, Isabel glanced at the table. The box was gone. She didn't see it in the kitchen either. When she asked Matthew the next morning, he swore he hadn't moved it. Neither had Linnea. They found it in the hallway outside the crawlspace door, twine neatly retied, angled exactly as it had been on the counter the day before. No one said a word. Chapter 7. The Room That Answers. The rain backed off toward evening but never left. It hovered there, a damp thought that couldn't complete itself, and the house wore it like a shawl. The orchard kept to its aisles. The red twine tree behaved. The ground did not swell or sigh. It was the kind of truce that makes a person suspicious, the stillness you get when children have stopped arguing in the other room. They sealed the windows they knew not to force. They left the crack in the plaster that wanted to stay. They set the pear jar and the listening glass in their appointed places and laid a small fan of rice across the back threshold, not tossed, properly strewed, and said no prayers out loud because the house remembered too well how their grandmother had spoken and disliked imitations. "I'll stay until midnight," Linnea said, setting her satchel on the kitchen chair that nobody ever sat in. "Then I'll go home and let the house hold its midnight without me. Houses like to count their own 12. "What happens at 12? Matthew asked. "Nothing you can convincingly tell a neighbor," she said mildly. "They did supper the way people do when the night has conditions. Plates warmed, stew reheated, bread cut carefully into equal slices as if fairness could be proof against mischief. The hurricane lamp glowed on the table, making a small republic of gold against the drafty borderlands of the room. The spoon lay beside the jar, clean and patient. "Tonight," Linnea said, "we will not open the box. We will not go to the attic. We will not stand with our backs to any closed door, and we will not ask the house a question we don't intend to live with. We will, if asked, answer by moving a chair." "Chairs and spoons," Matthew said, half a joke now, but it didn't find traction. They settled in the parlor after dishes. The wedding photograph observant above them, the oak chair nudged that polite thumb's width from yesterday's place, the braided rug with its old river colors worn thin where people had done their living. The box sat on the low table like an argument made of wood and patience, twine neat, grain pale where handling had polished it. No one touched it. The house put its hum on, that purr you only learn to hear when you're tired enough to listen with your bones. Somewhere a door ticked in its frame. Somewhere a nail conjured a small, solitary squeal and then decided against repeating itself. Isabel felt the familiar press at the back of her neck that meant attention had entered the room. Not sight, not sound, just the feeling of being in a sentence that has not yet chosen its verb. "Glass," Linnea said gently to Isabel, nodding at the dining room cabinet. "Once only." Isabel fetched the listening glass. It had the old cloudiness of poor soda ash and a nick on the rim that could sing if you ran a damp finger around it. She brought it into the parlor and held it on her lap like a candle at a vigil. "When you're ready," Linnea said. She wasn't ready. She put the open mouth against the north wall anyway. Sound arrived like steam condensing. Faint at first, then unmistakable. Not words, not pipes. The dry, papery slide of pages turning. 3 turns. A pause. A 4th, slower, as if the hand had lingered on something. Isabel felt it in her teeth, the soft friction, the hush after, the small breath someone takes before they start reading. "What do you hear?" Matthew asked. "Paper," she said, "like the ledger, but not in this room." Linnea shook her head once. Not the ledger. The glass warmed against Isabel's palm. For a heartbeat. Only one. And perhaps because she had expected nothing, the nothing gathered itself into a voice. It did not speak a sentence. It asked a question. Her grandmother's timbre, yes, but younger, less tired, using the exact old kitchen cadence that made instructions sound like gifts. "How many are you?" Isabel jerked the glass away. The noise cut. She stared at her own hand, at the faint damp ring the rim left on the wall. It asked, she said, and couldn't finish. Once a day, Linnea said softly. We don't ask twice. How many are we? Matthew asked, but not as a joke. He counted them with his eyes, then stopped before he reached the number that would make the room smaller. The lamp flame leaned toward the hallway and steadied. The wedding photograph looked like photographs look when a room changes its mind about light. The faces grew deeper, the whites muddied, the black suit coats taking on an oily sheen. The sixth suggestion in the reflected window clarified not to a face, never so obligingly literal, but to the geometry of a person who remembered how to stand and had never stopped. Chairs, Linnea said quickly. Answer. Isabel rose. She lifted the oak chair and slid it 2 handspans left, toward the door to the hall. The scrape was honest wood on honest rug. In the baseboard under the wedding photograph, a tiny sound answered. Not knock, not creak, not animal. The sound of something that had been poised relaxing by a degree. The landline rang once, decided it would not, and quit. The refrigerator kicked on to make mortal noises on purpose. The storm gutters sighed. The house, temporarily appeased, turned a shoulder and let them borrow an hour. They tried small talk and heard themselves employ it like people rehearsing civility for a visit with someone's stern aunt. They drank coffee that insisted on tasting like metal, and no one accused the pot. The clock slid toward 11. Then the box moved. Not rolled, not skittered, not dragged. It changed angle on the table, as if someone had set their palm on it and turned it a patient 2 degrees to face the stair. No one's hands had been near it. The twine lay obedient across the lid. Matthew stood. He did it slowly, as if each vertebra wanted to convene a committee. No, he said to the air. Not loud. Yes, firm. The box, having made its point, remained. Chairs, Linnea said again, softer. Doors. Isabel stepped into the hall and, without thinking, straightened the runner, aligning its herringbone edges with the baseboard notch that had always been their grandmother's mark for, the house will tolerate this much. The runner lay, satisfied. A breath moved through the stairwell and left it balanced. She felt, more than heard, a small consent. She went back into the parlor. The lamp had gone down a shade. The wedding photograph had obeyed some minute gravity and hung now perfectly straight. Matthew reached for the box's twine and stopped his fingers an inch away. If it asks again, he said, to Linnea, to the house, to the orchard wherever it was in the dark, what do we do? Answer in chairs, Linnea said, or in spoons. Never in nails. What does that mean? Isabel asked, though she had an idea. It means we don't fasten anything tonight, Linnea said. We don't bar or bind or nail. We don't force a sentence to end. We choose to be understood. At 11:30, the room changed temperature the way a mouth changes subject. Cool gathered low, a draft walking at ankle height, careful and deliberate, like a child stepping between sleeping dogs. The spoon on the table vibrated once, twice, the barest tremor. When it quieted, a bead of syrup climbed the handle against gravity and made a small, luminous dome at the tip, then stood there, impossibly, without falling. Don't breathe on it, Linnea whispered. They did not breathe on it. They were living statues, while the bead held its question. After a long, unkind half-minute, it let go. It fell into the jar with that coinsure plop that meant payment, meant reply, meant I have heard you, and I am counting. The landline did not ring. The attic did not footstep. The box did not change angle again. But the house gathered itself. The hum shifted low. Lower than Isabel had heard it. Somewhere in the chest of the place where voices go when they don't want to wake sleepers. Midnight arrived the way it always had, without theatrics, by a clock that worked, and the minute hand made its respectable climb past the 12. No bells, no odd electricity, only the sensation of the ledger page turning. The listening glass, which had been asleep in the cabinet, made a tiny ping without being touched. How many are you? The kitchen asked again. Not in a voice. In the arrangement of objects. The 3 chairs in the parlor and the solitary kitchen chair, the lamp and its shadow, the box and the space it was making for itself. Answer, Linnea said, and for the first time her voice had urgency. Matthew lifted the fourth chair and carried it into the parlor. He set it where no one had ever put a chair, in the doorway, half in, half out, the way a person lingers when they don't yet consent to enter and cannot bear to leave. He stepped back. The house answered back. Every door in the downstairs, kitchen, parlor, hall closet swung a gentle inch inward and stopped.
No van. No Islam.
An exact, synchronized concession. Welcome, with conditions. Point of no return, Isabel said, not afraid, not brave, simply accurate. The attic door, upstairs, out of sight, unlatched. They heard it. Clean, unmistakable. The particular tongue of metal against strike plate that a house learns and rehearses until it is the only theater it knows how to put on. No draft had run. No window had opened. A latch had lifted itself as tidily as a hand. Stay where you are, Linnea said, and the way she said it made the words heavy as iron. Do not climb. Do not call up. Chairs and spoons. The box answered with scent. Apples gone to cider. Paper turned sweet at the edges. A hair of smoke. The twine did not slip. The lid did not rise. But inside it, Isabel knew this the way you know a weather change in your joints. Something set itself in order. The sound of pages. One turn. A pause. How many are you? The house asked for the third time, full voice now in its furniture, in its airs, and in the square of darkness at the foot of the stair. 4, Isabel said before she could stop herself. Linnea made a quiet, strangled sound that could have been either approval or grief. Matthew did not look at the stair. He looked at the photograph, the groom's bad collar, the bride's patient face, the 6 geometry in the window that would never become a face. He lifted his hand, palm out, the way you do to halt a dog you love. We'll make room, he said. We won't open what we can't close. The attic door did not close. It remained politely unlatched, like a mouth that has promised not to bite if you agree not to put your fingers between its teeth. Midnight is over, Linnea said finally, though the clock said different. We've let it count. We'll live with that. They sat the way people sit after hearing a verdict they can accept but not like. The lamp flame regained its plumb. The humming rose a little out of the basement, out of bone. The spoon lay clean. When at last they slept, because even people being counted have to. The house did the small indecencies houses do when they have won a point. It turned the runner a degree. It straightened the photograph to a plane no human hand ever aligns. It moved by the exact width of a ledger's page, the box toward the hall. In the morning, Isabel would swear she had dreamed that last inch. Matthew would swear he had not. Linnea would not swear at all. Before she left, at 12:07, at the back door, one boot on the threshold as if she too were mindful of mouths, Linnea touched the frame lightly with 2 fingers, almost a benediction, almost a password. You answered, she told the house. We heard. The house, which had always been polite, let her pass. They woke to a different arithmetic. 4 chairs stood in the parlor, one in the doorway, and the spoon lay exactly where courtesy would put it for a guest who comes before breakfast. On the table, 3 pair seats made their small triangle and the 4th sat aside, pointing not to the door now but to the stair. And on the stair, exact as a ledger line, a single damp footprint waited, not muddy, not dirty, just a print where no rain had fallen, heel and arch and the splay of toes, as neat and unarguable as a signature. Matthew set his hand on the newel post to steady himself. Isabel did not climb. Neither of them said the word ghost because it was too cramped a word for a thing that had asked politely to be counted. They didn't have to. The house had taken its step, and the orchard, quiet in the daylight like an accomplice sleeping late, kept its counsel. Today, Linnea said when she returned at 9, we'll change nothing, and it will change everything. She looked at the footprint and did not touch it. You've crossed your line. Good. Now mind it. What if it asks again? Isabel asked. It will, Linnea said. You'll answer in chairs. You'll answer in spoons. You'll answer by not opening the box, no matter how politely it starts to explain its reasons. "And the attic?" Matthew asked, and his voice betrayed nothing about his legs, which had decided all by themselves to keep him rooted to the lowest step. "When the house unlatched it, it offered you a door it wanted," Linnea said. "Houses do that when they intend to tell you more than you ask to know. We will let it keep wanting." They stood in the parlor and looked at the place where a fourth chair made the room wrong and right at once. The box waited by the hall table, patient as a parcel no one had ordered. The listening glass kept its counsel in the cabinet. The pear jar wore a ring on the table that hadn't been there last night, arranged just so with the others, a neat little constellation that meant we are not finished without being rude about it. When the church bell in town counted the hour, it did not skip 4. The house, not to be outdone, made a soft, approving click under the stair. And Isabel, who had lived in houses that kept quiet because they were empty and houses that kept quiet because they were mean, recognized this new quiet for what it was, not peace. Attention. The orchard breathed in. The house breathed out. Somewhere between, the footprint dried a shade lighter and did not fade. And the day, decent and gray and useful, went on, carrying their decision like a seed in its cheek, waiting for them to plant it or spit it out. Chapter 8. Noon like a door. Morning came honest and gray, the kind of light that doesn't promise anything it can't deliver. The footprint on the stair did not fade in the night as wetness should. It dried a shade lighter, yes, but kept its crisp heel, its shallow arch, the splay of toes like a hand pressed into flour. Isabel stood 2 steps below it with her coffee and felt the peculiar intimacy of seeing where a body she could not name had once balanced its weight, how the big toe bit a little deeper, how the ball flattened just so. The wood around it had taken on a faint bloom, not damp, not dust, something in between, as if the stair had been remembering out loud and had not yet stopped. "Don't wipe it," Matthew said, coming up behind her. He had already washed and dried the spoon and set it beside the pear jar with the fastidiousness of someone you'd trust with a wound. "If it wants to be gone, it will go. If it doesn't, we'll be accused of mopping history." "I wasn't going to," Isabel said, and then caught herself glancing around for a towel she might have fetched without knowing why. The house liked to catch you in small betrayals. Linnea arrived with a thermos and 2 newspapers under one arm, one from town, one from somewhere else that still printed stock tables, as if people should be reassured by columns of numbers road type. She set them on the table without comment and looked at the stair the way an old veterinary looks at a horse in a field. Not for what's wrong, but for how wrong it is today compared to yesterday. "It's moved," she said mildly. "No," Matthew said, automatic. Then he frowned and crouched, measuring with his hand from riser to riser, from newel to tread. "1 finger width toward the hall," he admitted. "How?" "Warm wood." "We'll walk," Linnea said. "So, we'll memory if it has somewhere to go." She turned her head toward the kitchen window, where the orchard had arranged its morning. Not bright, not ominous, simply out there wearing the weather it had been given. The house smelled faintly of apple skin, but not the sweet high note of a new bite. This was the smell left in a bowl after you've lifted the fruit out, a tender ghost. Under it lay something green and mineral, creek water cool. The back door was shut. The rice at the threshold had kept its prudent curve. Isabel crossed the room and touched the glass. The pane was cold, the cold that has nothing to do with air but with intention. By 10 the footprint had edged another fraction toward the hall. The shift was so small she would have missed it if the coffee ring on the table hadn't made her greedy for proof. She began to set things down on purpose, and then later check their allegiance. A pencil left parallel to the table's grain now lay the slightest degree off. 3 apple seeds she'd put in a tidy triangle last night sat in a line, pointed like compass needles toward the parlor. It was daylight, and nothing was pretending not to be daylight. Still, the room behaved as if noon were a place you could arrive at early, by choosing the wrong route. "The orchard's in here," she said without drama. "It does that when the day is thinking too hard," Linnea replied. She poured from the thermos. The coffee steamed in the cold air like a breath you could bring to the bank as currency. "We'll be dull and practical for a while. Dullness is a roof." They were obedient. They were dull. They paid the bills that had been arranged in a stack by an unknown, tidy hand. Isabel rewrote a list of fittings for the trench and put the pen down cap first because the house appreciates ends. Matthew measured the cellar hatch and the back steps and the south window and wrote the numbers where a previous Crowe had written numbers and then rewritten them harder. Linnea sat with the town paper and read it the way you read a friend who insists on being harmless. When she turned a page, the sound was oddly loud. The listening glass kept its counsel in the cabinet like a teacup that knew better than to volunteer. At 11, the air in the hall grew a degree cooler while the kitchen warmed. It wasn't a draft. Drafts have ambitions. This was a redistribution, like a house shifting coins from one pocket to another. The footprint paled slightly, as if powdered by light. It had moved again, or the stair had moved under it. Isabel put her hand on the newel post. The wood felt warmer than the air, warm like a body that has been stepping aside for hours. They ate early lunch because the day asked for it, bread with a rind that argued back, cheese that kept its shape when you cut it thin. Isabel fetched the jar of pears unconsciously and then set it back as if she'd caught herself reaching for a person's hand without asking first. Noon slid toward them. She felt it. Felt noon approach like a visitor you haven't invited but cannot pretend not to see from the front window. In town, noon means break and laughter and the particular base of men who refuse to be impressed by weather. Here, noon meant the house practiced midnight in a brighter key. "We'll use the glass once," Linnea said quietly into that bright hush. In daylight, the house isn't good at lying. "I thought we weren't supposed to ask twice," Matthew said. "Once per day," Linnea said. "We gave last night to listening. Day gets its turn." Isabel fetched the listening glass and didn't like the way it had warmed in the cabinet, as if it had been held recently. She put the rim against the parlor's interior wall. North again, in the bright of day where the light made even would look freshly named. At first, she heard only the soft hum of electricity pretending to be bees. Then, like a photograph developing in a tray, the sound came clear. Water. Not rain. Not sink. Not creek. Water being poured slow from a height into a vessel. The sound reached the brim. The pitch changed and stayed. There followed the careful, restrained set down of a heavy jar on wood, the touch of metal on glass, and a small, satisfied exhale from a mouth that had been taught to be quiet. Isabel pulled the glass away and looked at the table where the jar sat closed, the spoon clean and idle. "It's playing back what we did last night. It's telling you what it remembers of how to behave," Linnea said. "Houses learn better from small courtesies than from lectures." "Then why does it feel like we're being graded?" Matthew said, too lightly, and no one laughed. At 12:07 precisely, Isabel would have sworn by anyone's God, though she had none, the footprint changed. It did not smear or evaporate. The toes, which had pointed toward the stairs' rise all morning, rotated exactly a few degrees until they aimed toward the hall. The shift was so clean it made her teeth ache. It wasn't water creeping. It wasn't settling. It was choice. "Do not stand in its path," Linnea said, not urgent, only final. They stepped aside. The house released a narrow ribbon of cold that walked along the baseboards from stair to hall. It smelled of peel and leaf and that faint iron of creek stones. The ribbon reached the corner, hesitated, and turned, not toward the kitchen, which would have made narrative sense, but toward the little closet under the stairs that had always smelled faintly of wool and rain. The door clicked once, as if cleared of a throat, and cracked itself open the width of a coin. Isabel did not reach for it. It would have been like putting your fingers in the mouth of a dog defined by kindness, impolite and, worse, unneeded. The box did not move. The space around it did. Chairs were chairs, and yet when she looked back at the parlor, the two on either side of the low table had angled their shins a hair toward the hall, an unphotographable slant, the kind you feel with your knees when you go to sit and find the angle wants your body to turn. The lamp's fringe had quivered and gone still. The wedding photograph hung on its nails so exactly true that no human hand would have dared touch it. "Don't open anything," Matthew said, rereading the rules aloud the way a driver says the speed limit when he sees a patrol car. At 12:20, the light in the kitchen flattened to a sort of pewter thought. Shadows under the apple bowl became brief and square. The orchard smell thickened even with the windows latched. The hair on Isabel's arms lifted at the same time the rice at the threshold shifted without rolling. 3 grains edged inward together like geese choosing footing on short ice. The 4th grain stayed a breath behind, as if it had been told manners. "Is noon doing what midnight does?" Isabel asked, quiet enough that the question would not make the hour proud of itself. "Noon is when the house rehearses," Linnea said. "Midnight is when it performs." The attic door upstairs, unlatched since last night, did not open. It simply accepted noon with the kind of decorum that makes children step more carefully on carpets. Even that was somehow worse. Intention well-behaved is intention with stamina. They did practical things because practical things keep lids on days. Washed 2 windows they were allowed to wash, mended a loose hem on a curtain, with stitches uneven on purpose because perfection invites, took inventory of jars and sugar and the stubborn bag of flour that tasted like the pantry if you let it. All the while, the footprint dialed its degree, and the house adjusted its temperature, and the light learned new corners. Sometime after 1, Isabel climbed to the landing but stopped short of where the attic stair turned. She hadn't planned to. Her feet had gone to do a harmless errand and had found themselves held in a different sentence. The air up here was a little cooler, a polite church cool. The unlatched door at the top, lavatory green still, obedient to a regrettable decade, rested with the contentment of a mouth that has learned not to drool. On the floor at the threshold, just outside, not inside, lay an object that had not been there last night and could not have fallen there without someone providing fingers. It was small and ordinary enough to be terrifying, a button. Bone, not plastic. For holes. The surface had the soft shine of something rubbed for luck or grief. Thread still clung to it, dark, almost black, and at one edge, a tiny crescent where a needle had chewed too near. Beside it, 3 apple stems lay parallel, and a 4th lay slantwise like a pointer toward the stair. "Don't step over," Linnea said from the bottom landing, her voice traveling up with the weight of an older command. "Don't reach into a hive you haven't smoked. If it has learned to hand you things, you take them on your side of the door." Isabel crouched without crossing and cupped the button into her palm. It was cool and heavier than it should have been. She knew whose coat it belonged to, though no story could prove it. The Sunday black in one of the photographs, the one their grandmother had called good enough to be buried in. She closed her hand and felt, absurdly, that the house had pressed something back into the family, like a friend who'd kept a key for years and chose noon to return it. "Thank you," she said to air, to wood, to the part of story that can hear. They did not bring the button to the kitchen. They set it on the little table by the stairs with the honesty of people who aren't trying to hide evidence from a magistrate. The footprint seemed to approve by deepening a hint, or perhaps the light chose that moment to gain opinion. At 2, the orchard leaned into the house visibly. The leaves outside made their thin clatter, and the same sound, softer, papery, came from inside the hallway where no leaves had any right to be. You could write it off as the old wallpaper rubbing itself, except the wallpaper didn't carry the dim green of living. Isabel stood under the sound and felt the way a person feels under a skylight when birds cross, a brief passing of pattern above the skull. "Listen," Matthew said from the parlor. He had not moved. The box had not moved. And yet the room had turned a fraction. Chairs, lamp, minds, toward the hall closet that had cracked its coin width open at noon. They didn't love that closet. It held coats and the smell of wet, and the idea of winter. Now it held a thin, sustained note like a fingertip on a glass rim. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand. It made the promise of breaking if you insisted on ignoring it. "Once," Linnea said, "and not with the glass. Put your ear. Promise to stop when it stops." Matthew put his ear to the door and did not turn his back to the hall. Isabel put her palm flat against his shoulder to keep his spine remembering its job. The note held, wavered, rose a hair, fell. It stopped. They kept their promise and straightened. "What is it?" he asked, and his voice sounded the way men sound when they're ready to accept an unhelpful truth. Chairs, Linnea said. It's asking for chairs. They brought none. They had already placed 4, and that was the number the house had asked for last night. You don't start adding chairs when you haven't agreed who is sitting. The afternoon performed ordinary tasks with the concentration of a schoolchild determined to be good while company is over. Light moved across floors. The clock minded its business. Somewhere in town, a siren sounded and grew smaller without ever having been large, and all the while noon did not quite conclude. It extended itself the way dusk can when a cloud holds the sun like a cigarette ember cupped in a hand. 3 o'clock felt like a long shallow of noon rather than the beginning of after. At 4, small, undeniable things had accumulated to the weight of a decision. The footprint had moved the last inch to the hall and stopped at the line of the closet door. The rice at the back threshold had drawn itself, no rolling, to a cleaner curve. The pear jar had traveled, by degrees a person could swear were a lie, to the exact center of the table. The listening glass, without being touched, had taken on the faint warmth of a held object. We'll change our day, Isabel said out loud, before anyone asked her to. We'll treat noon like midnight. We won't cross thresholds between 12 and 1. We won't open doors that open by themselves, even for a little. We won't move chairs except when asked. Matthew nodded, slow as a ratchet. We won't run the pump at noon either, he added. If the house is counting, it doesn't want to be competing with noise. Linnea smiled, proud or relieved, or merely acknowledging they'd learned what could be taught. You'll eat early or late, she said. You'll speak in low voices. You'll make lists in pencil because ink believes too hard in permanence. She touched the button on the stair table with a knuckle, not lifting it. You'll leave found things where they can see the door. The last wrongness of the day was quiet and unarguable and nothing you could photograph. At 5:12, with all 3 of them in the kitchen, the parlor lamp brightened a fraction and then settled, though no hand had turned the knob and the electricity had not hiccuped. At 5:13, the lamp in the parlor dimmed a fraction and then settled again. In the moment between, the box shifted its weight, not angle, not position, but weight, and the low table groaned the way it does when it has agreed to host a thing for longer than it intended. When Isabel went in at 5:14 and touched the table, the grain felt like a palm that had accepted a secret. That's the irreversible thing, she said quietly, knowing it even as she said it. It lives here now by day as well. Or we live with it, Linnea said. The difference is polite but important. They closed the listening glass in the cabinet and left it there. They put the spoon beside the jar in that exact way the house had taught them. They did not straighten a single picture. At the stair, the footprint no longer looked like newness. It looked like a fixture. Noon had failed to end at noon, and they had agreed to behave accordingly. When evening came on like a sensible decision rather than a mood, the orchard exhaled its creek cool into the kitchen and rested. The house let the temperature even. The closet door closed itself the width of that same coin with a click that did not ask for chairs. The button at the attic threshold remained precisely where Isabel had placed it on their side of the door, and that, more than anything, felt like a treaty. They ate at 6 with lamplight and the smell of bread and the blessedly stupid comfort of routine butter. They spoke of Pete's trench guy and whether the French drain would ruin the roots near the wash table, and whether you could run a new line to the pump without waking whatever carried the humming. All the while, Noon's new law sat with them like a well-mannered guest at the far end of the table, not interrupting, not insisting, offering only the kind of attention that makes you more careful with your elbows. Tomorrow, Matthew said, I'll mark the hour on the map. Crown at noon. Corridor closed. Not closed, Linnea corrected, and the correction was gentle enough to be a blessing. Respected. They cleared plates in quiet coordination. When Isabel reached for the dish towel, she stopped. The house had inclined itself in that subtle way, a sense more than a sound, a posture altered. She looked to the parlor and saw what the day had been practicing toward. The 4 chairs had not moved, but the space between them had become a shape, a square more square than furniture ever makes by accident. It was not an invitation. It was a statement. How many are you? The night would ask again when it had the right to, and she knew now what they would answer. By day, the question would not be spoken, but noon would hold its hands up to show its still counted fingers. They let the lamp burn low. They left the button where a house could see it. They did not cross the hall between 12 and 1 anymore, and though no neighbor could be convinced of why, and though any explanation would die of daylight, the rule fit their bodies like work, learned by doing, taught by weather, held by place. When they finally slept, it was under a new arithmetic. The house had shifted the weight of noon and lodged it in their bones, the way orchards lodge weather in wood. And outside, the red-twined tree did nothing you could quote, which felt, after a day like this, like kindness. Chapter 9, The Hour Between. The day after noon's new treaty began in good faith. The house seemed willing to honor it. By late afternoon, the light through the orchard was rich with the gold that makes even rotted fence boards look painted, and the smell from outside was simply leaf and soil, not the more demanding perfume it had pressed through the walls yesterday. Isabel stood at the sink peeling potatoes, the kind you buy from a neighbor's porch by leaving cash in a tin, and listened to Matthew talking with Linnea in the parlor. His voice had the relaxed weight of someone thinking about trenching depth, not footprints and buttons. It was a relief to have the house quiet in its bones. No slow drafts curling from door hinges, no chair legs inching themselves to new angles when no one was looking. Even the listening glass sat cold in its cabinet, as if it were simply a family curiosity again, not a mouthpiece. By 4:30, shadows stretched in that long, unspooling way that makes the orchard seem like it's reaching toward the house with steady patience. The footprint on the stair, had not moved since it reached the closet yesterday. Linnea had walked by twice without so much as a glance at it, which felt like permission for everyone else to treat it as an old mark in the wood, a knot in the grain you happened to notice. Then, around 5, the first change, the kitchen clock gave a single, soft tick out of rhythm. Not loud, not broken, just late. Isabel froze mid-slice, holding a potato like a fat white stone, and stared at the clock face. The hands were correct. The tick after was on time. But the sound it had made, that delayed click, seemed to arrive from somewhere further away than it should have. She listened harder. Nothing followed. They ate supper while there was still light, keeping the lamp unlit. Matthew had taken to laying out plates without a word, spacing them in exact arcs on the table. Isabel had caught him adjusting the knife blades so each pointed precisely toward the pear jar's lid.
She didn't comment.
It was the kind of habit you developed when you believed the house noticed. The evening air was comfortable. The orchard gave only the small rustle of leaves lifting and settling again. Isabel thought, for the first time in days, that she could almost feel at home. It started with the draft. Not a cold one, not the kind that snaps curtains. This was the reverse, a warm breath from the direction of the attic stair, carrying with it a faint scent of apples past their prime and something like sun-warmed wood. It wasn't strong enough to be alarming. You could have told yourself it was a pocket of heat dislodged from the rafters by the day's cooling. But it kept coming, slow and even, like the exhale of something alive that didn't care to hide the fact. Linnea noticed first. She was standing near the hall with her tea and turned her head toward the stair without moving her feet, the way animals turn to sound before they decide whether to run. "That," she said softly, "isn't for us." "Then who?" Matthew began, but stopped when the attic door gave a low, wood-on-wood sigh. Not a creak, not the pop of settling. A sound like the door had leaned forward on its hinges to hear better. Isabel found herself halfway to the landing before she thought better of it. She hadn't meant to move, but the warm air felt like an invitation. Not kind, not cruel, just certain. The smell deepened the higher she went, the bruised apple scent thickening, overlaid with something faintly metallic, like a coin pressed in the mouth.
She stopped 3 steps from the top.
The attic door was open the width of her hand. The button from yesterday was gone. In its place, directly on her side of the threshold, lay a small, folded square of paper. The fold was exact, each edge aligned with the care of someone who had nothing but time to get it right. The paper itself looked like it had been torn from an older sheet, slightly yellowed, with a faint green line running horizontally near the top, as if from a school notebook. She didn't pick it up. "It's paper," she called down. "Just paper." Matthew and Linnea stood together at the bottom of the stair, their faces tilted up into the half-light. "Don't open it here," Linnea said. "Where then?" "Nowhere yet." They left the folded paper on the stair table where the button had sat, the footprint just beyond it like a sentinel. The warm draft withdrew slowly, as though it were being reeled back into the attic by something patient. The rest of the evening behaved itself, until the rain began. The first drops came at 7, hard, heavy splats on the porch roof, the kind you hear before you smell them. The orchard darkened fast, losing its detail in the distance until it was just a wall of motion, leaves flashing pale, and then dark again in the wind. The house reacted. The closet door in the hall closed itself, firmly, no hesitation, as though keeping the rain out were its private duty. Somewhere upstairs, something soft and weighted slid across the floor, the sound muted by whatever old carpet still lived under the attic dust. The footprint on the stair darkened again, freshened by some invisible damp. Matthew went to check the windows, and that's when they discovered it. In the parlor, one of the window frames was simply gone. Not open, not broken, gone. The glass was there, perfectly set into the wall, but the wood frame that had always surrounded it, painted white, with a faint groove at the bottom where Isabel once kept a sprig of dried rosemary, was missing as though it had never existed. The glass met the plaster without seam or trim. Outside, the rain slid down in smooth sheets without catching on anything. Frame doesn't just. Matthew ran a hand along the edge, where it should have been. You'd hear it. You'd smell the dust. Isabel touched the bare edge of glass. It was warm. Linnea stood in the doorway, the folded paper in her hand. "It's testing," she said. "It's seeing how much can vanish without a sound." They stayed in the kitchen after that, listening to the rain. No one mentioned the attic. No one asked about the paper. But all three of them glanced toward the stair table more than once, as though the fold might open by itself if stared at long enough. When they went to bed, the footprint was still there. The paper was still closed. The window was still warm where the frame used to be. And in the attic, something shifted its weight again. Not loud, not obvious, just enough to make the ceiling sound a shade thicker than it had before. Chapter 10, The Paper That Knew. They did not open it at night. By common consent, a consent reached without words, the way a family learns to pass the salt. The folded square lay on the little table by the stair until morning brought its gray, honest light. The footprint on the tread had dried to the paler shade it wore by day, healed precisely at the edge of a hall where the closet had once breathed. The missing window frame in the parlor was still gone. The glass met plaster like a wound neatly sutured without skin. The house smelled faintly of leaf and apple bowl and something greener, as if the orchard had hung its coat on a chair inside and forgotten to take it back out. "Before breakfast," Linnea said, and the way she said it made opening a ritual rather than an appetite. "So we don't teach it that answers arrive on an empty stomach." They took their places as if a photograph would be taken. Matthew at the end of the table closest to the hall, Isabel at the long side, hands flat. Linnea standing because she had the look of someone who doesn't sit for tests. The hurricane lamp was cold and unnecessary, the pear jar sealed, the spoon obedient. Isabel reached for the paper and stopped an inch short as if expecting heat. It was cool. Thin. The fold held crisp as a good habit. She lifted the top and found another, a smaller fold inside, like a mouth that knows how to keep its tongue. Her fingers wanted to be careful for reasons older than the paper. She unfolded again. Handwriting, not print. Ink brown to the color of dried tea. The hand itself had a manner you could almost hear. Upright, tidy, a little proud of getting its strokes clean. Not the grandmother's square block letters. Not the pinch script that had labeled keeps and tithes in Elias's ledger. Newer than that, older than them. It rode the faint schoolboy green line near the top and ignored the rest of the page as if the lines were advice, not law. Isabel read aloud because the paper demanded a voice. "How many are you? How many will you be? How many chairs stand between your room and the hall? Count slow. Do not lie. Her tongue stuck briefly at the last sentence, not because it was strange, but because it made her feel 9 years old and facing her grandmother's wooden spoon, not for hitting, but for tapping the edge of a bowl in time with instructions. Below the questions came a list. Not the ledger's numbers, not dates. Names, 5 of them, to which no memory attached. Then a 6th line where a name should have been, and wasn't, only the long underline of a person not yet written. After that, smaller lines as if the writer had worried the point of the pen against the paper to make more room. And then, wrenchingly, the words turned from strangers into their house. Do not open the red. Do not nail the mouth. Move a chair when you are counted, and set a spoon when you are fed. Noon is a door. Midnight is a mouth. If the frame vanishes, speak thanks and let it think. If a window warms, someone is standing there on the other side. Matthew exhaled through his teeth, a small, involuntary sound of a man who has been told his own thought by something that should not have it. Turn the page, Linnea said quietly. There isn't. Isabel began and then saw it. The paper had been folded not once but 3 times. The last crease made a pocket of itself. She teased it open. Another line waited, written smaller, the ink younger. The same hand on a different day, or the same day with a harder truth. When you open this, you will be 3, and you will say 4. Do not correct yourselves. It is polite to make room. No one spoke for a count of 5. The count wanted 4. They gave it more. How? Matthew said at last, voice low. How would anyone who wrote that know what we said? You're asking what we always ask, Linnea said, not unkindly, when a house explains itself at a time that doesn't suit us. When did the house write this? And who had the hand for it? Those questions are honorable and useless. Isabel looked back down. The paper had one last space, the bottom margin a quiet square. Ink dotted it, as if the pen had hesitated and then obeyed. A single ring had been drawn there, so faint she would have missed it if the light hadn't decided to favor it with a plane of shine. A circle, like the wet imprint a spoon leaves on a table. Inside the ring, 3 little seeds had been inked, and then a 4th set off to the right, just so. The exact arrangement from the night they had learned to count out loud, without numbers. She wasn't aware of moving the page until Matthew caught her wrist. His fingers were gentle and firm, the way you stop someone from walking into a fence that doesn't look like a fence. Don't turn it toward the hall, he said. I wasn't going to, she lied, and the lie tasted like a child's lie. So harmless it squeaked when it moved. The kitchen clock ticked. The house shifted its attention the way a person shifts a chair before beginning a story. The folded paper's edges curled minutely as if humidity had learned how to read. Read the rest, Linnea said, and Isabel discovered there was more not because she had seen more but because her mouth began speaking without being told to. If the box asks for nails, refuse it. If the orchard asks for names, refuse it. If the attic asks how many stairs, do not count in front of it. If the house asks how many you are, you will answer 4 until it makes it so. The last sentence did not sit on the line. It hung there, a fraction higher, as if the hand had lifted to keep the words from touching the paper too hard. They didn't breathe properly for the length of 2 ticks. Then the house answered the way a rural house answers when it agrees that something has been said correctly. It made an exact, untheatrical sound, a soft click beneath the stairs, where wood meets old iron. Not loud. Final. The listening glass in the cabinet pinged like a polite bell. Matthew pushed his chair back a slow inch. We don't have to. The parlor lamp brightened. Not a flicker. A decision. The missing frame in the parlor reappeared, not by eyesore miracle or birth of wood from plaster, but by a wrong-a mercy. 1 second the glass met the wall. The next the white-painted trim sat neat as Sunday, damp to the touch and warm as living bark. No hammer had struck. No saw had cut. The rosemary groove at the bottom returned, empty, and smelled like the closest thing wood has to breath. Impossible, he said, not to argue but to record. Unmistakable, Linnea corrected. The paper in Isabel's hand warmed, as if it remembered being a body. The handwriting that had finished itself in brown ink did a thing brown ink cannot do. A new line wrote itself in the white at the bottom, not appearing all at once, but drawing letter by letter. No hand, only the pen's path made visible without the pen. The motion was patient and tidy and obscene. Isabel swallowed and watched their day get turned into grammar. You are 3 and you say 4.
Good. Keep saying.
Leave the 4th chair in the door. They watched until no letter followed, listened for a small house sound to reward neat penmanship. Nothing. The ink dried in real time. A fragile wet shine dulled to the paper's low luster. Isabel could have put her finger to it and come away stained. She didn't. That's the rule, Linnea said. Imposed, not asked. The threshold chair stays. We already do that, Matthew said, reflexive pride in compliance. You moved it yesterday to sweep, Linnea said. It knew. She looked toward the hall. The 4th chair stood half in and half out of the parlor, as they had placed it at midnight, making the doorway narrower than anyone liked. Now it will know if you move it for courtesy alone. It's counting into your housekeeping. Isabel felt, with the private shame of people who keep clean houses for judgment and not for help, how the sentence hurt. Her grandmother had made rooms that were square not because squares pleased her eye, but because squares were a promise. Now the house had its own square, and it had claimed the doorway as part of its mouth. What about? Matthew began, and stopped because asking about the attic put a taste in his mouth like pennies. The paper, unoffended by not being asked, wrote again. Not much. One word. Open. Linnea put her hand flat over the page with a decisiveness that had saved lives in other kitchens. No, she said to the house, to them, to whatever had found a way to write across what is usually a one-way surface. We are not doing open. The listening glass pinged again, closer to a complaint than a reward. The spoon on the table trembled. A bead climbed, decided against theater, and sank back with a small apology. In the parlor, the wedding photograph straightened itself to a plumb line no carpenter's level would dare enforce. Read the names, Isabel said, because to look away was to agree that seeing had been rude. She ran her finger under them, as one does for a child sounding out words. Names they did not know, in a set that ran odd. Abel, Crowe, Dinah, Lomax, Mercy.
5.
The 6th line had no letters. Only the long underline inviting a future to lay itself down like a fresh board. The pen's path curved there, a faint gray where someone had once hovered and not written, like the weight of a hand remembered in paper. Those are not our names, Matthew said. Which is good, Linnea said. When a house writes your names, the house is not counting. It's claiming. These are the names it has been given to store. Not yours. Not yet. How many are you? The first line had asked, and Isabel had thought the question meant the same thing houses and dinner tables mean by it. The paper had known better. It knew a second set of math, chairs and seeds and thresholds that people like her learned only after weather had made a stubborn case. Do not nail the mouth, she read again more quietly. It means the cellar door. And the red is the tree, Matthew said. We already knew that. Knowing is cheap, Linnea said. Refusing is expensive. They tried to behave. Then, as if they'd merely been given a page of instructions and not a contract written from both sides of the paper. They ate because breakfast had to be earned repeatedly. They cleared plates and put utensils back with an attentiveness that would have embarrassed them in other houses. At the back door, Isabel strewed rice with the practiced grace of someone who finally believed in the futility of tossing. 3 grains edged in together of their own accord, quick, purposeful. The 4th paused and pointed itself at the stair. Noon isn't for hours, she murmured, and the house, approving, moved a draft along the baseboard from kitchen to hall, a little river of cool that touched her ankles and was gone. When Matthew went to the parlor to look again at the healed frame, he found instead a different impossibility because the house had decided to be generous in a way that did not comfort. The frame had grown, not bigger, but greener. On its inner corner, where flesh would sprout if would remembered the tree too well, a single tender bud had pushed a nub of light green toward air. There was no soil. No rain had reached it. The bud had made its decision. He touched it with a fingertip, lightly. It was warm. It was living. He wiped his finger on his jeans with the shame of a boy who has touched something sacred without washing his hands. "This is not harm," he said to the room, to himself, to the hard square in his chest that wanted ordinary. "This is wrong," in a generous voice. Generous mouths still bite, Linnea answered from the doorway. They tried not to look at the paper again. The paper did not respect pretending. It warmed on the table and then cooled, the way living things do when their attention changes rooms. At mid-morning, a new line appeared without flourish, the ink daintier as if the pen had been held by a different hand or by a hand learning gentleness. "Do not stand between the fourth chair and the stair." Isabel obeyed, without knowing she obeyed. She stepped around the invisible path between chair and footprint. Passing through it now felt like stepping briefly into someone else's code. Warm in the arms, wrong in the shoulders. By noon, the house wore its new law like a badge. The rice kept its prudent curve. The listening glass refused to ping when tapped, a small mercy. The spoon did not climb. The attic door remained politely unlatched and did not push farther. Only the footprint changed, quietly, openly, a thing choosing to be seen. The pale print that had sat all morning at the hallward edge of the stair thickened, not darker with damp, not cruder with weight, thickened like ink laid twice. The toes turned a degree more toward the hall, as if to say we agree, and we are not done in the same movement. "Read the rest," Matthew said, though there was no rest to read. He wanted the paper to have run out of voice. It had not. It had saved the worst for the bottom. The lines there were cramped, as if the writer had run out of space, and the hand had lost some of its tidy pride. The words were the kind people speak when they make rules and don't know how to phrase kindness. When there are 5 chairs the house will choose. Do not bring a 5th. Do not be a 5th. People visit, Matthew said, almost indignant, almost laughing at the absurdity of a house with guest policies. He will come to look at the trench. Gus will bring screws. We can't. Chairs aren't people, Linnea said. Chairs are how a house counts people. There's the math of shoes at the door and the math of wood underweight. Don't invite both sums on the same day. Then what do we? Isabel stopped because the word she'd been about to say, what do we do, was the exact sort of word you don't say into a mouth that likes to catch them and offer help you didn't ask for. They made new rules over the old ones because that's how families survive intrusive arithmetic. Noon remained a door. Midnight remained a mouth. The 4th chair would remain half in and half out of the parlor, ugly as a necessary sign. No one would cross the hall between 12 and 1. No one would open the attic. No one would name what was being asked if they could answer with a spoon or a chair instead. And now, no 5th chair in the parlor. Not for company. Not for spite. Not for a holiday that pretends to be larger-hearted than sense. Imposed, Linnea said, signing the rule as if the paper needed a co-signer. Not negotiated. The house, satisfied with the filing, performed its most impossible kindness as if payment had been made in exact change. For one sustained breath of time the orchard came into the kitchen not in scent or draft or shadow, but in light. The window over the sink brightened, not with sun. The weather was sullen, but with the particular green of leaves seen from inside a body. A shifting, liquid green, the color of light gone through skin and sap. For the length of a held inhale, the room glowed that inside green, and everything looked as though it had been brought up from the ground and placed gently on a table. Isabel saw her own hands illuminated that way and felt she was not being looked at so much as grown back. Then the color drained like a thought deciding against itself. The ordinary gray returned. The bowl of apples looked meek. It's in, Matthew said, hushed and practical. It's been, Linnea said. Today it told us we're behaving. Isabel lowered her eyes to the page one last time, because resisting would have made a child of her. No words moved now. The ink lay dead and declarative. She folded the paper shut on the last line with the same care she'd used to close a living eyelid. Where do we keep it? Matthew asked, because there is always the question of where to store a thing you haven't been given but now cannot put down. In the kitchen, Linnea said. Where rules belong. Not the ledger? Isabel asked. The ledger is a man's agreement with himself with the night listening, Linnea said. This is the night's agreement with us, with the day watching. It will sulk if you shut it up with numbers. They slid the paper into the narrow drawer where their grandmother had kept string and pencils and a small notebook of weights for jam. The drawer closed without complaint. The house let it. The listening glass did not ding. The spoon rested. The fourth chair held its post. The footprint did not leave the stair. In the afternoon, Pete did drive up with his trenching estimate and his hat in his hand, as if hats still meant something between men. They met him on the porch. He did not come inside. He did not sit. He swore amiably at the weather and stamped his boots and talked about French drains. When the rain lightened, they walked to the far fence together and counted paces. Pete hauled a cough up out of his chest and said he'd be back Wednesday with a man who could run a line without making the orchard opinionated about it. He did not cross the threshold. By accident or grace, the house did not have to count him. At dusk, with the new rules settled into their bodies like a splinter smoothed over by skin, Isabel stood at the sink and washed 2 mugs and a bowl because you rinse daylight off your hands before you agree to the dark. In the parlor, the lamp's fringe went still. The bud on the restored frame showed the faintest green again. The photograph hung square. The fourth chair cast its stubborn shadow across the doorway like a bar laid gentle across a mouth. In the hall, the footprint waited, obedient as proof. The attic door, unlatched but not eager, reflected nothing. The red twine tree, which had the sense to do its wrongness outside, held its shape in the first proper night for hours. Somewhere far off, the creek rehearsed its S like an instrument that needed work. The house approved of the way they had chosen to be counted and returned to its hum, that low civic purr, like a town with a church bell that never skips 4 because the hour demands a number and the number demands a tone. They ate. They set the spoon. They strewed. They answered once with a chair and once with a silence. When the paper in the drawer rustled, no one named it. They had been given a rule, and they were tired, and the day had shown them how the inside of a leaf looks when a house decides to turn its face outward through a window, and there is only so much looking you can do in 24 hours without teaching your eyes to hunger. Tomorrow, Matthew said, not as a hope but as a schedule. Tomorrow, Linnea said, tired in a precise way that means the world has behaved for now, in its own manner. Tomorrow, Isabel said, and the house, never one to be rude when people remembered their places, gave, from somewhere under their feet, a single consenting knock to mark the end of the lesson and the beginning of the next rule they did not know they were already obeying. Epilogue, the orchard's arithmetic. By the second week, the rules had stopped feeling like rules. The fourth chair was just the chair now, a narrow-mouthed piece of furniture that stood half in the parlor and half in the hall. They no longer swore when they bumped it. They brushed by like you do with an old dog that refuses to move from a favored spot. The drawer that held the folded paper was opened once a day for string or a pencil, and they would all glance in without meaning to, like checking a sleeping infant for breath. Sometimes the paper lay exactly as they had left it. Sometimes it sat a fraction closer to the drawer's edge, as though it wanted the view. Pete had finished the trench without incident. The orchard had been polite about it. No sap streaks on the spade, no rust in the water line. And so Pete declared the land good to work and promised he'd come back before frost to look at the roof. He did not step inside then either. No one asked him to. The footprint on the stair remained, though its shade shifted with the weather. On damp days it darkened. On cold ones it grew faint. Once, in the late afternoon, Isabel thought she saw it lift as though the foot had shifted weight, but the next blink returned it to stillness. The other rules had sunk into habit. Rice before noon. Never 5 chairs in the parlor. Never stand between the fourth chair and the stair. Never answer the attic. They didn't talk about the bud on the window frame, though they all saw it. It had unfurled a single leaf, pale and thin-veined, which somehow hadn't browned despite the drafts. It stayed green as if the frame were its root. There were other small things, the kind you could dismiss if you wanted to. The spoon, for instance, never needed wiping. Its bowl remained free of dust no matter how long it sat out. The rosemary groove in the windowsill sometimes smelled stronger on days no one had cooked. And every so often, when Matthew came in from the shed, he swore the orchard's shadows fell wrong. Not longer or shorter, just facing a direction the sun hadn't agreed to. No one in town asked about the rules because no one knew them, though once at the post office, Mrs. Bryony mentioned she'd passed their place in the evening and thought I saw someone at the upstairs window. Isabel had thanked her in a way that closed the subject. On the first frost of the season, Linnea rose before the others and found the folded paper open on the table. She hadn't put it there. She didn't think either of them had, though she didn't wake them to ask. The handwriting was the same tidy brown, the same upright strokes, but the words were different in tone, almost casual, as if the house were noting the weather. Winter counts slower. You may be 4 until thaw. Beneath it was an unfamiliar scrawl, cramped, rushed, the ink heavier where the pen had pressed. Just 3 words. Do not stop. Linnea refolded, slid it back into the drawer, and made tea. She did not mention the note to Matthew or Isabel, not because she wanted to keep it from them, but because she understood the most rural truth of all. Some rules are only kept if they're not spoken. That evening, the orchard stood black and sharp against the snow, each branch edged in light from the low moon. The house smelled of wood smoke and apples. The 4th chair waited in its place. And on the stair, beside the pale footprint they all knew, a second print had appeared, fainter, smaller, facing upward. It could have been a trick of melting snow on a boot. It could have been nothing at all. But they set another spoon at the table that night, just in case.